Hello friends and history buffs, how are you? I hope everything is going well. Today, we'll take a journey to the heart of the German Empire, a disciplined state where coal smoke met steel. If you find this magnificent and terrifying historical journey interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to join our family. Also, while thinking about the massive factories of that era, I wondered, what's your favorite engineering marvel? Let's meet in the comments. For centuries before the formation of the German Empire, what we now call Germany was not a single nation, but a scattered collection of independent kingdoms, duchies, bishops, and free cities. By the early 19th century, the number of these states had been reduced, but the land was still politically fragmented. At the heart of this fragmented world stood a contradiction. Strong regional identities, but a growing sense of shared language, culture, and heritage. The roots of this division go back to the decline of the Holy Roman Empire. Founded in the early Middle Ages, and often described as neither holy nor Roman, nor truly an empire, it was a loose confederation of territories, mostly within Central Europe. While it claimed continuity from the Roman tradition, it was a patchwork of semi-autonomous states under the theoretical authority of an emperor. Over time, real political power shifted to local rulers. By the 18th century, the Holy Roman Empire had become a symbol of political stagnation. It was complex, outdated, and incapable of unifying its members under a common policy or defense. Voltaire once quipped that the empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire that captured the mood of many reformers, who saw it as an obstacle to modern statehood. The key shift came during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s. Napoleon Bonaparte's campaigns across Europe not only brought military devastation, but also political reordering. In 186, the Holy Roman Empire was officially dissolved under pressure from Napoleon. In its place, he created the Confederation of the Rhine, a French client state composed of many German territories. While short-lived, this confederation effectively ended the centuries-old imperial framework and introduced modern ideas about centralized statehood. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, European powers met at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the continent's map. One result was the creation of the German Confederation, a loose alliance of 39 German-speaking states. This was not a nation, but a diplomatic arrangement designed to prevent the return of French expansion and to maintain the power of Austria and Prussia. Austria was the dominant force within the German Confederation. Ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, the Austrian Empire had centuries of experience, managing diverse populations, and was seen as the traditional leader of German affairs. But Prussia, once a minor kingdom on the northeastern edge of the German-speaking world, was beginning to emerge as a serious rival. Prussia's rise began under Frederick the Great, who ruled from the mid-18th century. Through military success and administrative reform, he transformed Prussia into a respected European power. Its efficient bureaucracy, disciplined army, and Protestant work ethic became defining traits. By the early 19th century, Prussia had a reputation for strength and modernity, even as it remained smaller and less prestigious than Austria. The rivalry between Austria and Prussia would come to define German politics throughout the 19th century. Both powers wanted influence over the German Confederation, but their visions for Germany were fundamentally different. Austria favored a broad multi-ethnic empire centered in Vienna, while Prussia imagined a more unified German-speaking state under its own leadership. As the Industrial Revolution spread across Europe in the early to mid-9th century, economic forces began to shift the balance. In 1834, Prussia established for Zollverein, a customs union that excluded Austria, but included most other German states. This created a single economic zone, removing trade barriers and helping to boost commerce and industry across northern and central Germany. The Zollverein did more than integrate economies. It aligned the interests of smaller German states with Prussia, gradually drawing them into its orbit. While Austria remained politically influential, it was increasingly cut out of the economic future of Germany. This laid the groundwork for a new power dynamic, one in which Prussia, not Austria, would lead the path toward unification. The revolutionary year of 1848 brought a new wave of change across Europe. Liberal and nationalist movements erupted, demanding constitutional reforms, national unification, and greater civil liberties. In the German states, these revolts were especially focused on the idea of creating a unified Germany under a liberal constitution. In Frankfurt, a National Assembly of German delegates, the so-called Frankfurt Parliament, convened to draft a constitution for a unified Germany. They offered the imperial crown to King Frederick William IV of Prussia, but he refused, declaring he would not accept a crown from the gutter, rejecting a crown offered by a popular assembly rather than by other monarchs. This refusal signaled the end of the revolution's hopes for liberal unification. The conservative order was restored and Austria reasserted its influence. But the idea of German unity was no longer just a dream. It had entered mainstream political discussion. The next decisive figure in this story was Otto von Bismarck, a Prussian aristocrat and political realist. In 1862, Bismarck was appointed President of Prussia. He made clear that unification would not come through parliaments and speeches, but through force. As he famously said, "The great questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood." Bismarck's vision was unapologetically Prussian and conservative. He did not seek a liberal Germany, but a strong state led by Prussia. He worked closely with King Wilhelm I of Prussia, and together they embarked on a plan to challenge Austria and bring the German states under Prussian dominance. To achieve this, Bismarck would first isolate Austria diplomatically, then defeat it militarily. But before confronting Austria directly, he needed to prove Prussia's strength and expand its influence. The first opportunity came in 1864 when Prussia and Austria jointly declared war on Denmark over control of the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, territories with mixed German and Danish populations. This brief war, known as the Second Schleswig War, ended in victory for the German allies, but it also sowed the seeds of conflict between Prussia and Austria. The two powers disagreed over how to administer the newly acquired duchy. Bismarck deliberately escalated tensions, maneuvering Austria into a diplomatic corner. By 1866, the stage was set for war between the two German giants. The resulting Austro-Prussian War, also called the 7 Weeks' War, was short but decisive. Prussia's modernized army won a crushing victory at the Battle of Königgrätz. Austria was forced to withdraw from German affairs entirely. Following the war, Bismarck dissolved the old German Confederation and created the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. Austria was excluded and Prussia emerged as the unquestioned leader among the northern German states. Southern German states such as Bavaria and Württemberg remained independent, but were now clearly within Prussia's strategic influence. The idea of a unified Germany was no longer hypothetical. It was a matter of time and of war. Prussia had the military, the economic strength, and now the political foundation. What remained was to bring the southern states into a common German nation. By the mid-9th century, Prussia had emerged as the dominant force in northern Germany. Its victory over Austria in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 had shifted the balance of power, eliminating Austria from German affairs and bringing the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. Yet Germany was still not a unified nation. The southern German states remained independent, culturally aligned with their northern neighbors, but politically cautious. Bismarck, the Prussian minister-president, now faced the final challenge: to unify all German-speaking states under Prussian rule. His solution was war. Specifically, a war that would make unification both inevitable and desirable. Otto von Bismarck understood the power of external threat. While he had used diplomacy, treaties, and military action to advance Prussia's interests, he believed that national unity could best be achieved by galvanizing public opinion through conflict. The southern states such as Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden were wary of Prussian dominance. They feared losing their autonomy within a larger German state. Bismarck needed a way to convince them that unity under Prussia was not only preferable but necessary. France would provide that opportunity. In the late 1860s, France was ruled by Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of the original Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon III sought to preserve France's status as the dominant continental power. He was wary of a strong, unified Germany on his eastern border, especially one led by an assertive Prussia. When the Spanish throne became vacant in 1870 and a Hohenzollern prince, Leopold, of the same royal house as Prussia, was offered the crown, France reacted with alarm. The idea of being surrounded by Hohenzollerns in both Germany and Spain threatened French strategic interests. France demanded assurances that the Prussian King Wilhelm I would permanently withdraw support for Leopold's candidacy. Wilhelm met with the French ambassador at EMS and politely refused further concessions. Bismarck then took this mundane diplomatic exchange and deliberately edited the king's report, the EMS dispatch, to make it appear as though Wilhelm had insulted the French envoy. The altered telegram was released to the press, and it had the desired effect. In France, public outrage soared. National pride demanded a response. In Germany, it appeared that France was acting aggressively toward Prussia. Within days, France declared war on Prussia. Bismarck had maneuvered France into appearing as the aggressor, making it politically easier for the southern German states to join the war on Prussia's side. The Franco-Russian War began in July of 1870. It would last less than a year, but have immense consequences. Prussia's military, strengthened by earlier reforms and experiences, was well. The general staff system developed under Helmuth von Moltke, the elder, allowed for rapid mobilization and coordination. The railroads played a crucial role in moving troops efficiently. Prussian tactics emphasized speed, precision, and overwhelming force. French forces, on the other hand, were poorly coordinated and lacked the same level of organization. Within weeks, the Prussians had taken the initiative. A series of battles across eastern France culminated in the catastrophic defeat of the French army at Sedan in September of 1870. There, Napoleon III himself was captured along with tens of thousands of soldiers. The Second French Empire collapsed and a new French Republic was declared in Paris. Yet, the war did not end. The new French government refused to surrender and instead called for national resistance. Prussian forces advanced and laid siege to Paris in the autumn of 1870. The siege lasted through the winter with harsh conditions and food shortages afflicting the civilian population. Despite sporadic attempts at relief and continued resistance, The city eventually capitulated in January of 1871 during the Siege of Paris. A symbolic and transformative event took place. On January 18, 1871, the German princes and military leaders gathered in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. It was there, amid the splendor of a defeated French monarchy's residence, that King Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed German Emperor, Kaiser of a newly unified German Empire. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. The unification of Germany was completed on French soil in a palace once associated with French dominance. The message to Europe was clear. The balance of power had shifted. The new German Empire consisted of 25 states, including 4 kingdoms: Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, and Württemberg, as well as numerous duchies, principalities, and city-states. Prussia was by far the largest and most powerful of these, and the imperial crown was held by the King of Prussia. Although the empire had a constitution and a federal structure, real authority rested in Berlin. Bismarck became the first chancellor of the empire, answering only to the emperor. The southern states, which had joined the war reluctantly, now found themselves part of a larger political structure dominated by Prussia, while some retained nominal independence in local matters. They were integrated into the empire's military, diplomatic, and economic systems. The constitutional arrangements reflected Bismarck's priorities: a strong central government under Prussian leadership with limited democratic input. The war had also transformed European diplomacy. France was humiliated and resentful. As part of the peace settlement, the new German Empire annexed the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, territories with mixed French and German populations, but symbolic importance to both nations. This annexation sowed the seeds of future conflict and became a source of enduring French bitterness. The unification of Germany through war marked a turning point in European history. For the first time, a powerful, industrialized, and centralized German state existed on the continent. This new Germany had vast economic resources, a disciplined military, and an assertive foreign policy. The creation of the empire would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Europe, and set the stage for both collaboration and confrontation in the decades to come. Bismarck had achieved his goal through a carefully orchestrated series of conflicts: the Danish War, the Austro-Prussian War, and the Franco-Russian War. He had unified Germany under Prussian leadership. He had used diplomacy, manipulation, and military force in equal measure. Yet, even in triumph, questions remained. What would the empire become? How would it maintain stability, manage diversity, and respond to the expectations of its people? These questions would define the next phase of German history. As the empire entered its first years, it faced the complex task of transforming wartime unity into lasting political order. On the 18th of January 1871, a defining moment in European history unfolded within the ornate Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Amid the aftermath of war, surrounded by German princes, military officers, and aristocrats, King Wilhelm of Prussia was formally proclaimed German Emperor, Kaiser of a newly unified German Empire. It was a symbolic act with far-reaching consequences. Germany, long a patchwork of independent states, had now become a single nation-state under Prussian leadership. The event marked not just the end of a centuries-old political fragmentation, but the beginning of a new and assertive power on the European stage. The decision to hold the ceremony at Versailles was no coincidence. The palace, once the seat of French royal grandeur, had been chosen precisely for its symbolic weight. For generations, France had considered itself Europe's cultural and political center. But now, in the wake of its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, it was forced to witness the emergence of a powerful German nation forged on French soil. For Bismarck and the German leadership, the setting was a deliberate expression of victory and national unity. Wilhelm had initially been reluctant to accept the imperial title. As a conservative monarch, he saw himself first and foremost as King of Prussia, and was wary of diluting his authority by assuming a broader role. But Bismarck, ever the strategist, managed to secure the support of the southern German states and presented the crown as a symbol of unity rather than domination. With the war ongoing and national sentiment at its peak, pressure from German princes and military leaders helped persuade Wilhelm to accept. The proclamation itself was both ceremonial and deeply political. General Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke, Bismarck, and the leaders of the German states stood assembled while Wilhelm stood at the center in full military regalia. The Grand Duke of Baden, Wilhelm's relative, stepped forward to proclaim him emperor. Cheers of "Long live Kaiser Wilhelm" echoed through the hall. The new German Empire had been born not through peaceful negotiation or democratic reform, but through military victory and elite consensus. Following the ceremony, Bismarck quickly turned his attention to the legal framework of the empire. The new constitution, finalized shortly after the proclamation, established Germany as a federal monarchy. It preserved the individual identity of the constituent states while centralizing key powers in Berlin. The empire was composed of 25 states, 4 kingdoms, 6 grand duchies, 5 duchies, 7 principalities, and 3 free Hanseatic cities, along with the Reichsland of Alsace-Lorraine. The emperor or Kaiser was the head of state and supreme commander of the military. He had the authority to appoint the chancellor, declare war with the consent of the Bundes, and represent Germany in foreign affairs. The imperial crown was tied to the Prussian throne, meaning that whoever ruled Prussia would also be emperor of Germany. This ensured that Prussia remained the dominant force in the new political order. The chancellor, appointed by the Kaiser, was the head of government and held real executive power. Bismarck, as the first chancellor, shaped the office in his own image. He answered only to the Kaiser and was not responsible to the parliament known as the Reich. This structure allowed Bismarck to maintain strong centralized control, while appearing to operate within a constitutional framework. The Reich, elected by universal male suffrage, was the lower house of the legislature. While it could debate laws and approve budgets, its power was limited. The Bundes, the upper house, represented the individual states and held greater influence, particularly in matters of constitutional change. Prussia held a disproportionately large number of votes in the Bundesrat, giving it a de facto veto over any legislative reforms. This imbalance ensured that the conservative elites who had engineered unification remained firmly in control. Culturally, the unification was met with widespread enthusiasm across much of the German-speaking world. Nationalist sentiment had been growing for decades, and the victory over France provided a powerful emotional foundation for unity. Newspapers, school books, and public monuments celebrated the new empire as the fulfillment of a long-held dream of national unity. Yet, not all regions embraced unification with equal enthusiasm. Bavaria, in particular, had been a reluctant partner in the process and retained a number of special privileges under the new arrangement. These included control over its own army in peacetime and certain exemptions from imperial taxes. The German Empire was a federal state, but it was far from equal in practice. Prussia accounted for roughly 2/3 of the empire's territory and population, and its dominance shaped every aspect of imperial policy, One of the most immediate challenges for the new empire was the integration of Alsace-Lorraine, the territory annexed from France as part of the peace settlement. While the region had a significant German-speaking population, many residents identified culturally and politically with France. The annexation was deeply resented in Paris and became a rallying point for French revenge, the desire to reclaim the lost provinces. This decision would haunt German diplomacy for decades to come and contribute to the deepening hostility between France and Germany. Domestically, the unification created both opportunity and tension. The empire inherited a strong military tradition, a growing industrial base, and a literate population. These were assets that Bismarck would soon use to build internal stability and project power abroad. But the new state also brought together diverse regions with different histories, religious affiliations, and political traditions. Managing these differences would be a central task for the imperial government in the years ahead. Religion was one source of division. While northern Germany was predominantly Protestant, many of the southern states were Catholic. The Catholic Church remained influential in social and political life, and its authority often clashed with the secular ambitions of the Prussian state. These tensions would soon erupt into open conflict during the Culture Kampf, a struggle between Bismarck and the Catholic Church over the control of education and clerical appointments. Another source of tension was the role of democracy. While the Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage, it had limited power, and its authority could be overridden by the Kaiser and Chancellor. This created a situation in which German citizens could vote, but had little influence over national policy. The system gave the appearance of popular participation without granting meaningful control. It was a compromise that satisfied conservative elites but left liberal and socialist forces frustrated. Despite these contradictions, the early years of the empire were marked by a sense of achievement and purpose. Germany had become a major power, unified under a strong state with a clear national identity. The empire had the tools to build a modern industrial economy, expand its military reach, and influence European affairs. Yet the very method of unification based on military conquest, elite agreement, and centralized authority also planted the seeds of future conflict. The political system lacked flexibility, excluded many voices, and relied heavily on the authority of a single figure, the emperor. As the empire moved forward, it would have to contend with rising demands for political reform, regional autonomy, and social justice. With the empire now officially established, Bismarck turned his attention to shaping its internal structure and external strategy. He would spend the next 2 decades managing the delicate balance between maintaining conservative control and addressing the pressures of a rapidly changing society. The foundations had been laid. The German Empire existed, but how would it endure? With the German Empire proclaimed in early 1871, Otto von Bismarck stood at the peak of his power. Having unified Germany under Prussian leadership, he now turned to the challenge of consolidating that unity. No longer focused on war and diplomacy, Bismarck became the architect of domestic policy in a nation that was newly created, but deeply divided in culture, religion, and political ideology. His goal was to preserve the imperial system he had helped create, strong, centralized, and dominated by conservative forces, while managing the emerging forces of democracy, socialism, and Catholic resistance. Bismarck served as both Chancellor of the German Empire and Minister-President of Prussia. These dual roles gave him immense authority. He was not accountable to the elected Reichstag, nor could he be removed by it. He answered only to the Kaiser. Yet despite these powers, Bismarck understood that maintaining the empire would require more than repression. He needed to neutralize opposition, create a sense of national identity, and prevent the rise of any force that could challenge the status quo. One of the first and most intense domestic conflicts Bismarck faced was with the Catholic Church. The German Empire, though largely Protestant in the north, included significant Catholic populations in the south and west. In many of these regions, the Catholic Church held deep influence over schools, civil life, and community identity. After the unification, the Pope had declared the doctrine of papal infallibility, asserting that the Pope was incapable of error in matters of doctrine. Bismarck saw this as a challenge to state authority. In response, he launched the Culture Comp, or Culture Struggle. Beginning in 1871, the aim was to reduce the power of the Catholic Church in public life and assert state control over religious matters. A series of laws were passed that placed Catholic education under state supervision, expelled Jesuits from Germany, and required priests to be educated in German universities. Civil marriage was made mandatory, and clergy who resisted the new laws were fined, imprisoned, or exiled. The Culture met fierce resistance. The Catholic Centre Party, which had formed in 1870, became a powerful political voice for Catholic Germans in the Reich. It gained growing support, especially as public sympathy turned against Bismarck's heavy-handed approach. Rather than weakening the Church, the campaign helped unify Catholics politically and increase their opposition to the imperial government. By the late 1870s, Bismarck began to reverse course. Recognizing that the Culture had failed to achieve its goals and had strengthened the Centre Party, he began rolling back the anti-Catholic laws. A quiet reconciliation followed. Bismarck accepted that the Catholic Church would remain a powerful force within German society and turned his attention to a new and rising threat: socialism. The rapid industrialization of Germany in the 1870s and 1880s had transformed its economy and society. Urban centers expanded, factories multiplied, and a growing working class began organizing for better conditions. The Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany, founded in 1869, gained momentum as it advocated for labor rights, universal suffrage, and social reform. Though still relatively small, Bismarck saw the Social Democrats as a revolutionary threat to the existing order. In 1878, after two failed assassination attempts on Kaiser Wilhelm I, Bismarck seized the moment. Although the Social Democrats had no connection to the attacks, he used the incidents as justification to introduce the anti-socialist laws. These laws banned socialist meetings, newspapers, and organizations. Social democratic leaders were harassed, arrested, and exiled. Public expressions of socialist ideas were suppressed. Yet once again, Bismarck found that repression alone was not enough. The socialist movement continued to grow underground, and working-class frustration only deepened. In a calculated move, Bismarck decided to co-opt the socialist agenda by offering reforms from above. He introduced the world's first modern welfare state, not out of humanitarian concern, but as a political strategy to undercut socialist appeal. Between 1883 and 1889, Bismarck introduced a series of social insurance programs. These included health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions. Workers were granted protections in cases of illness, injury, and old age, funded through a combination of employer, employee, and state contributions. These policies were revolutionary in their time and became models for later welfare systems around the world. Bismarck's social policies helped to blunt the appeal of the Social Democrats, but they did not eliminate the party's growth. By the end of the 1880s, the Social Democratic Party of Germany had become a significant force in national politics. While they remained marginalized by law, their influence in public debate and worker organization was undeniable. In addition to confronting religion and socialism, Bismarck was deeply concerned with maintaining the unity of the empire through centralized control. He viewed nationalism as a tool to bind the diverse regions of Germany under a single identity. The government invested in national symbols, education reforms, and public celebrations that emphasized loyalty to the Kaiser and the empire. Veterans groups, patriotic festivals, and monuments became common features of public life. Yet beneath the surface, regional identities remained strong. Bavaria, Saxony, and other southern states continued to see themselves as distinct from Prussia. Local traditions and dialects persisted, and many Germans viewed Berlin's authority with suspicion. Bismarck's challenge was to project a national identity without provoking too much resistance to centralization. Bismarck also faced the delicate task of managing the empire's parliamentary institutions. While the Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage, its power was limited. Bismarck used it strategically, passing laws when necessary, ignoring it when possible, and dissolving it when convenient. He distrusted political parties, seeing them as threats to unity. Yet, paradoxically, his own policies encouraged the development of a party-based system. In addition to the Centre Party and the Social Democrats, conservative, liberal, and nationalist parties emerged to represent various interests. The Chancellor's relationship with the Reichstag was often tense. When it suited him, Bismarck worked with different coalitions to pass legislation. But when opposition grew too strong, he relied on the Kaiser to dissolve the parliament and call new elections. This pattern revealed a central feature of the German constitutional system. The appearance of democratic representation existed, but real power remained with the executive. By the late 1880s, Bismarck had been at the center of German politics for nearly 3 decades. He had unified the country through war, secured it through diplomacy, and stabilized it through domestic policy. Yet his authority was increasingly questioned. Kaiser Wilhelm I, who had supported Bismarck's policies, died in 1888. His son, Frederick III, succeeded him, but reigned for only 99 days before dying of cancer. Frederick's son, Wilhelm II, ascended the throne later that year. The young Kaiser was ambitious, impulsive, and determined to rule in his own right. He admired Bismarck's accomplishments, but bristled at the Chancellor's dominance. Tensions between the two grew rapidly. Bismarck's authoritarian style and unwillingness to share power clashed with Wilhelm's vision of personal rule. The conflict came to a head in 1890 when Wilhelm demanded greater influence in policy and cabinet appointments. Bismarck refused. After a series of disputes, Wilhelm forced Bismarck to resign in March of that year. The Iron Chancellor's era had come to an end. Bismarck's legacy was immense. He had built a unified German state, navigated complex domestic challenges, and maintained peace in Europe through careful diplomacy. But his political system was rigid, reliant on elite control, and resistant to democratic change. With Bismarck gone, the question remained, could the empire survive without his hand at the wheel? The departure of Bismarck opened the door to a new era, one marked by ambition, global aspiration, and a dramatic shift in foreign and domestic priorities. The man who succeeded him would not be a chancellor or politician, but the emperor himself. While Otto von Bismarck is often remembered for his role in unifying Germany, his accomplishments in foreign policy were equally significant. Following the wars that established the German Empire, Bismarck shifted from a policy of military confrontation to one of careful diplomacy. His goal was not expansion, but preservation. He understood that Germany, now a dominant power in the center of Europe, could easily provoke fear and hostility from its neighbors. To avoid this, Bismarck focused on maintaining peace through a complex network of alliances designed to isolate France, reassure other powers, and keep the newly formed empire secure. Bismarck's foreign policy rested on a few basic principles. First, Germany should not seek additional territorial gains in Europe. Second, France must be diplomatically isolated to prevent it from forming alliances that could threaten Germany. Third, cooperation with Austria, Hungary, and Russia was essential to maintain stability in the East. And finally, Germany must avoid naval rivalry with Britain, which could trigger a confrontation the empire was not prepared to handle. After the Franco-Russian War, France remained humiliated by its defeat and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Its government and population viewed Germany with deep resentment. Bismarck knew that France would seek revenge and would likely try to build alliances to support its cause. To prevent this, Bismarck worked to keep France diplomatically isolated and politically weak. His first major step was the formation of the League of the Three Emperors in 1873. This informal alliance linked Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, the three great conservative monarchies of Central and Eastern Europe. The agreement was meant to preserve the political status quo and suppress revolutionary movements. Though ideologically aligned, the alliance faced challenges due to conflicting interests, particularly in the Balkans, where Austria-Hungary and Russia competed for influence. In 1879, after tensions with Russia increased, Bismarck signed the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary. This formal agreement stated that if either power were attacked by Russia, the other would come to its aid. It was a defensive alliance, not directed against France, but it marked a more permanent alignment with Austria-Hungary. Bismarck considered this alliance essential because he viewed Austria as a strategic partner in containing potential instability in the Balkans. To maintain ties with Russia, Bismarck expanded the dual alliance into a broader agreement in 1881 called the Three Emperors League. It was a renewal of the earlier understanding among Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, but it attempted to reconcile their competing interests in the Balkans through diplomatic arrangements. Still, these agreements remained fragile. When the Three Emperors League collapsed in 1887 due to renewed conflict between Austria, Hungary, and Russia, Bismarck responded with a secret treaty known as the Reinsurance Treaty. Under this arrangement, Germany and Russia promised to remain neutral if either were involved in a war with a third power, so long as Germany did not attack France and Russia did not attack Austria. This treaty exemplified Bismarck's skill in managing conflicting relationships without committing to offensive war. The Reinsurance Treaty was never made public, and it required delicate balancing. Bismarck's goal was to prevent France and Russia from forming an alliance which would leave Germany vulnerable to a two-front war. By maintaining cooperation with both Russia and Austria, Bismarck created a system where no major power could afford to oppose Germany directly without risking internal instability or external vulnerability. Meanwhile, Bismarck maintained cordial relations with Britain, though the two empires had different priorities. Germany focused on continental affairs, Britain on overseas empire. They had no direct territorial disputes. Bismarck was careful not to provoke naval competition and avoided colonial rivalry whenever possible. He supported British interests in some cases, such as the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers met to establish rules for colonizing Africa. Although Bismarck himself had little initial interest in overseas expansion, the empire eventually acquired colonies in Africa and the Pacific. These included German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, Togond Cameroon, and several island territories. While small compared to British or French holdings, these colonies marked Germany's entry into global imperial competition. Bismarck managed this cautiously, viewing colonial ventures primarily as bargaining tools in European diplomacy rather than national priorities. The overall structure of Bismarck's diplomacy became known as the Bismarckian system. It was characterized by its flexibility, complexity, and reliance on secret treaties. Bismarck was less interested in ideological alignment and more focused on practical stability. He acted as a mediator among European powers, using Germany's position at the center of the continent to influence outcomes without provoking direct confrontation. His approach also emphasized deterrence over aggression. Germany maintained a powerful military but did not pursue offensive wars. Instead, Bismarck used alliances and careful communication to reassure neighboring states. For example, when France attempted to build closer ties with Italy, Bismarck responded by drawing Italy into the Triple Alliance in 1882. This pact joined Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy in a mutual defense arrangement and further encircled France. Yet Bismarck's system had vulnerabilities. It depended heavily on his personal judgment and ability to navigate diplomatic tensions. The agreements he crafted were often contradictory, designed to plate different powers with opposing interests. This meant that even minor changes in leadership or circumstances could cause the entire structure to unravel. Additionally, the secrecy of many of the treaties made long-term trust difficult to maintain. Domestically, Bismarck used foreign policy successes to reinforce his authority. The stability of Europe under his guidance helped legitimize the authoritarian structure of the German Empire. Conservative elites could point to peace and prosperity as evidence that the existing system worked. This external calm also allowed Bismarck to focus on internal challenges such as managing religious conflict and addressing the rise of socialism. However, Bismarck's foreign policy left little room for democratic input. Decisions were made behind closed doors, often without consultation with the Reich. This created a gap between the German people and the direction of national policy. While the empire projected strength abroad, it remained politically rigid at home. By the late 1880s, cracks were beginning to show. Russia grew increasingly suspicious of Germany's closeness with Austria-Hungary. France continued to seek allies and invest in its military. Britain, while still friendly, was beginning to notice Germany's growing economic and naval power. Although war had been avoided, tensions simmered beneath the surface. When Kaiser Wilhelm II ascended the throne in 1888, he inherited a foreign policy system that was effective but fragile. Bismarck's resignation in 1890 removed the architect of this careful balance. Wilhelm's more aggressive and personal approach to diplomacy would soon challenge the stability Bismarck had worked so carefully to preserve. In the end, Bismarck's foreign policy was one of containment, prudence, and equilibrium. He had no desire for empire building through conquest, no interest in challenging the world's naval powers, and no appetite for ideological crusades. His aim was to keep Germany safe, prosperous, and respected without triggering war. For nearly 2 decades, he succeeded. But with Bismarck gone, the question became, would his successors understand the delicate architecture he had built, or would they tear it down in pursuit of something more grand? When Kaiser Wilhelm I died in the early months of 1888, it marked the end of an era that had defined German unification and conservative governance under Otto von Bismarck. Although Wilhelm had not always agreed with Bismarck's methods, the two had maintained a workable partnership for nearly 2 decades. But Wilhelm's son, Frederick III, who succeeded him, reigned for only 99 days before succumbing to illness. The throne then passed to Frederick's son, Wilhelm II, a young monarch with a very different vision for Germany's future. Wilhelm II was just under 30 years of age when he became emperor. Energetic, ambitious, and proud, he was determined to assert his personal authority over the government. Unlike his grandfather, he had no intention of allowing his chancellor to dominate imperial policy. Wilhelm believed in the divine right of kings and saw himself not as a constitutional figurehead, but as the active leader of the German Empire. He once famously declared, "There is only one master in the Reich, and that is I." This mindset immediately set him on a collision course with Bismarck. The Iron Chancellor had grown accustomed to running Germany's domestic and foreign affairs with minimal interference from the monarchy. Bismarck viewed the emperor as a symbolic figure, while he, the Chancellor, ensured stability through pragmatic control. Wilhelm, however, wanted influence, attention, and independence. The two men clashed on key issues from social policy to the handling of the rising Social Democratic Party. Tensions reached a peak over the issue of anti-socialist legislation. Bismarck had used emergency laws for years to suppress the Social Democrats. But these laws required periodic renewal by the rich. As political opposition grew and public sentiment shifted, Bismarck sought even harsher restrictions, proposing that all state employees be required to report subversive activity even in private conversations. Wilhelm opposed the idea, believing it would provoke more unrest and alienate moderate workers. He also wanted to position himself as a modernizing monarch who could appeal to the working class. Another source of disagreement was Bismarck's foreign policy, particularly the secret reinsurance treaty with Russia. Wilhelm disliked the secrecy and ambiguity of such agreements. He believed that Germany, as a powerful and modern empire, should act openly and confidently. He also wanted to align more closely with Britain, a country he admired and where he had family ties through Queen Victoria, his grandmother. Bismarck, on the other hand, feared that favoring Britain too strongly would push Russia into an alliance with France, something he had spent his entire career trying to prevent. The final rupture came in March of 1890. In a dramatic meeting, Wilhelm demanded control over cabinet appointments and proposed changes to the constitution that would increase his authority. Bismarck refused. Their conversation reportedly turned confrontational, with Wilhelm asserting his will and Bismarck warning of the dangers of abandoning his policies. Within days, Bismarck was dismissed, though officially he resigned under pressure. The fall of Bismarck was a turning point in the history of the German Empire. For nearly 3 decades, he had managed the delicate balance of domestic stability and European diplomacy. His system was complex, often autocratic, but it had kept Germany united and at peace. With his departure, that balance began to unravel. Wilhelm II's new course was based on the idea of personal rule. He wanted Germany to be recognized not just as a European power, but as a global one. He envisioned an empire with influence on every continent, a strong navy to rival Britain, and a dynamic culture that embraced modernity. This ambition was known as wealth, politic, or world policy, a deliberate break from Bismarck's policy of cautious continental diplomacy. One of the first effects of Bismarck's absence was the failure to renew the reinsurance treaty with Russia. Without Bismarck's guidance, Wilhelm and his new advisors let the agreement lapse in 1890. Russia, feeling isolated and increasingly suspicious of Germany's growing alignment with Austria-Hungary, turned to France. By 1894, France and Russia had signed a military alliance. Exactly the scenario Bismarck had worked so hard to prevent. Domestically, Wilhelm also began promoting policies that emphasized his personal image and imperial prestige. He traveled widely, gave flamboyant speeches, and portrayed himself as a forward-looking emperor in tune with the industrial age. He supported technological progress, scientific innovation, and naval expansion. But while Wilhelm sought to project strength and confidence, his government lacked the strategic clarity that had defined the Bismarck years. The internal political structure of the empire also began to strain under Wilhelm's leadership. Without Bismarck's firm hand, conflicts among the political parties in the Reichstag became more pronounced. The Social Democratic Party continued to gain support, fueled by growing worker dissatisfaction and urban poverty. The Kaiser's efforts to appeal to the working class through limited social reforms were not enough to reverse the trend. Meanwhile, the conservative elites, landowners, industrialists, and military leaders remained powerful, but divided over how to handle the changes sweeping German society. Some favored more repression, others called for reforms. The result was policy drift. The government passed few major laws during this period and often relied on imperial decree rather than legislative consensus. This lack of coherent leadership created a sense of political stagnation, even as the economy and military continued to grow. Culturally, Wilhelm II promoted a version of German nationalism that emphasized loyalty to the emperor, military pride, and civilizing mission abroad. Monuments were built, uniforms celebrated, and imperial symbols proliferated. While this helped solidify a shared national identity, it also encouraged an aggressive worldview that would later contribute to confrontational foreign policies. Wilhelm's break with Bismarck also changed the tone of German diplomacy. Where Bismarck had operated in shadows, building secret alliances and mediating conflicts, Wilhelm preferred public gestures and bold rhetoric. He gave interviews to foreign newspapers, made dramatic declarations about Germany's place in the world, and frequently undermined his own diplomats with off-the-cuff remarks. This unpredictability made it harder for other European powers to interpret Germany's intentions. At the same time, Wilhelm surrounded himself with advisors who were less independent than Bismarck. Chancellors who followed, such as Leo von Capri and Bernhard von Bülow, lacked the political weight to shape policy decisively. Real power remained with the Kaiser, but his focus was often more theatrical than strategic. As a result, German policy became more reactive and less coordinated, especially in response to international crisis. By the end of the 19th century, Germany had become a major industrial power, a military heavyweight, and a rising global actor. But it had also become diplomatically isolated, politically unstable, and increasingly divided at home. The dismissal of Bismarck had removed the one figure capable of holding together the contradictions of the empire. In his place stood a monarch driven by ambition, but often unsure of how to realize it. The shift from Bismarck's realism to Wilhelm's ambition marked the beginning of a new chapter in the empire's history, one defined not by caution and balance, but by risk and expansion. As Germany prepared to pursue its place in the world, it would soon find itself navigating alliances, rivalries, and crises that Bismarck had long warned against. With the dismissal of Bismarck in the spring of 1890, the German Empire entered a new chapter, one marked by ambition, expansion, and increasing global visibility. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany adopted a bold new strategy that broke sharply from Bismarck's cautious and defensive foreign policy. This strategy, known as Weltpolitik, or world policy, aimed to establish Germany as a global power, both politically and militarily. Weltpolitik was not a formal doctrine laid out in a single document. Rather, it emerged as a guiding principle under Wilhelm II's reign, reflecting his belief that Germany, as a rising industrial and military power, deserved a greater role on the world stage. No longer content with Bismarck's focus on European balance and peace, the new leadership believed that prestige, influence, and even survival depended on overseas presence and naval strength. Central to Weltpolitik was the idea of building an empire that matched Britain's in scale and stature. Although Germany had acquired a few colonies in Africa and the Pacific during the Bismarck era, these were limited in economic value and size. Wilhelm and his advisors saw colonial expansion as a way to gain raw materials, secure markets for German industry, and project national pride. They believed that without overseas colonies, Germany would fall behind in the global hierarchy of empires. To carry out this vision, the German government began investing heavily in its navy. Until this point, Germany's naval forces had been modest, focused mainly on coastal defense and protection of trade routes. But Wilhelm envisioned a blue water navy, a fleet capable of operating across oceans and challenging the naval supremacy of Britain. This ambition was formalized with the appointment of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz as State Secretary of the Imperial Naval Office in the late 1890s. Tirpitz became the architect of Germany's naval expansion. He promoted what became known as the Tirpitz Plan, a long-term project to build a modern battle fleet centered around heavily armed battleships. His strategy was based on the risk theory, the idea that if Germany built a navy large enough to inflict serious damage on the British Royal Navy in a conflict, Britain would be deterred from attacking in the first place. Even if Germany could not match Britain ship for ship, the threat of damage would serve as a strategic equalizer. In 1898, the Reichstag passed the first naval law authorizing the construction of new battleships and cruisers. A second, more ambitious naval law followed in 1890. Over the next decade, Germany poured resources into shipbuilding, establishing large naval bases at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven and launching new warships at an accelerating pace. These developments did not go unnoticed. Britain, which had long maintained its global dominance through naval superiority, regarded Germany's build-up as a direct threat. For centuries, Britain had followed the two-power standard, maintaining a navy larger than the next two largest navies combined. The German challenge prompted an arms race at sea, with both nations expanding their fleets and introducing new classes of dreadnoughts, the most advanced battleships of their time. This naval rivalry had broader diplomatic consequences. Previously, Britain had pursued a policy of splendid isolation, avoiding formal alliances and focusing on its empire. But Germany's growing naval threat led Britain to reevaluate its position. In the early 20th century, Britain moved closer to France and Russia, forming the basis of what would later become the Triple Entente. While politic increased Germany's visibility on the world stage, it did not yield significant colonial gains. Most of the world's territories had already been claimed by other powers during the earlier waves of imperialism. Germany's later arrival to the colonial game meant it had to settle for what remained: territories like German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, Togoland, and Cameroon. These colonies required investment and military presence, but offered limited returns in terms of trade or strategic advantage. Still, the symbolic value of empire mattered greatly to Wilhelm II and the nationalist press. Colonial ventures were celebrated at home through exhibitions, popular literature, and school curricula. The image of Germany as a civilizing force abroad was promoted aggressively, even as resistance in the colonies led to brutal suppression. One of the darkest chapters was the Herero and Nama genocide in German Southwest Africa between the early 1900s and 1908, where German forces conducted a systematic campaign of extermination against local populations resisting colonial rule. Domestically, Weltpolitik was popular among conservatives, nationalists, and many industrialists who saw new opportunities in overseas markets and military contracts. The naval arms race fueled shipbuilding and steel production, benefiting large industrial firms such as Crew and Blohm & Voss. Patriotic associations, like the Navy League, promoted support for the fleet among the public, organizing rallies and producing propaganda to justify the costs of expansion. However, the focus on external prestige did not resolve Germany's internal political tensions. The Social Democratic Party continued to grow, representing an increasingly urban and industrial working class. The gap between the authoritarian political system and the expectations of a more politically aware population widened. The Kaiser's government, although energetic in foreign affairs, remained resistant to meaningful democratic reform. In foreign policy, Germany's assertiveness often backfired. Without Bismarck's subtle diplomacy, the empire found itself increasingly isolated. France, once diplomatically cornered, forged closer ties with Russia. Britain, feeling threatened by German naval power and overseas ambitions, began aligning itself with both. By the early 20th century, Germany was surrounded by a tightening web of rival alliances. Incidents such as the First Moroccan Crisis in 195 further damaged Germany's diplomatic standing. In an effort to challenge French influence in Morocco, Wilhelm II visited Tangier and declared support for Moroccan independence. This provoked a sharp response from France and led to an international conference where Germany found itself diplomatically isolated. The outcome confirmed the growing cooperation between Britain and France and marked a failure for Weltpolitik diplomacy. Another consequence of Weltpolitik was the expansion of military planning. The General Staff, particularly under the influence of strategists like Alfred von Schlieffen, began developing detailed war plans that assumed the likelihood of conflict on multiple fronts. The Schlieffen Plan, finalized in the early 20th century, envisioned a rapid strike against France through Belgium, followed by a turn eastward to face Russia. The plan reflected the strategic environment shaped by Germany's increasing isolation and the perceived need to strike first in the event of war. As Germany's diplomatic relations grew more strained and the naval arms race intensified, the risk of conflict increased. The empire under Wilhelm II's leadership had achieved recognition as a great power, but at the cost of provoking deep mistrust among its neighbors. Its pursuit of prestige had led to militarization, isolation, and a fragile balance of power in Europe. By the eve of the First World War, Germany had become a nation of contradictions. Economically advanced, yet politically inflexible. Militarily powerful, yet diplomatically encircled. Culturally confident, yet socially divided. Weltpolitik had given Germany a louder voice on the global stage. But it had also accelerated the rivalries and tensions that would soon erupt into the most destructive conflict the continent had ever seen. as the 19th century drew to a close and the 20th century began. The German Empire was undergoing a transformation that would place it among the world's most advanced and dynamic economies. Beneath the pageantry of imperial ambitions and naval rivalries, a powerful engine of industrial and scientific progress was reshaping German society at every level. The empire was not only a political and military force, it had become a modern industrial powerhouse, rivaling Britain and the United States in output, innovation, and infrastructure. Germany's industrial revolution began relatively late compared to Britain and France, but once it gained momentum in the second half of the 19th century, it advanced with remarkable speed and coordination. The foundations of this success had been laid during the era of unification with the establishment of the Zollverein Customs Union, the expansion of the railway network, and the growth of a technically skilled workforce. By the final decades of the 19th century, Germany's industrial production was surging. Coal, steel, and chemicals formed the backbone of this new economy. The Ruhr Valley became the center of coal mining and heavy industry, with cities like Essen, Dortmund, and Bochum transforming into industrial hubs. The Krupp family, long a name in cannon manufacturing, expanded its operations into steel, locomotives, and industrial machinery. German steel production, once modest, quickly surpassed that of Britain by the early 20th century. The chemical industry was one of the most innovative sectors. German scientists and industrialists developed new processes for manufacturing dyes, fertilizers, and synthetic materials. Companies like BASF, Bayer, and HOEXT became global leaders in chemical production. Germany's dominance in dyes, for example, was so comprehensive that by the early 1900s, over 4/5 of all dyes used globally were produced by German firms. Scientific research played a central role in this industrial expansion. The German education system had placed a strong emphasis on science, engineering, and applied research. Universities and technical schools produced a steady supply of chemists, physicists, and engineers who moved easily between academic and industrial settings. This close relationship between science and industry became a hallmark of German development. The success of this model can be seen in figures like Fritz Haber, who alongside Carl Bosch developed the Haber-Bosch process for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen in the atmosphere. This innovation, first achieved in the early 20th century, revolutionized agriculture by enabling large-scale production of fertilizer. It also had far-reaching military applications in the production of explosives. Haber's work exemplified the dual nature of German science, capable of advancing both human welfare and military power. The electrical industry was another area where Germany excelled. Companies such as Siemens and AEG, Allgemeine Electricity at Gesellschaft, were at the forefront of innovation in electrical engineering, power generation, and communication technologies. Electric streetcars, telegraphs, and lighting systems became increasingly common in German cities. By the outbreak of the First World War, Germany was producing more electrical equipment than any other country in Europe. Infrastructure development kept pace with industrial growth. Germany's railway network expanded rapidly, facilitating the movement of goods and people across the empire. Canals and rivers were modernized to support inland shipping, and urban centers grew rapidly as rural populations migrated to cities in search of work. Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich became major centers of commerce, finance, and innovation. This economic transformation had profound social effects. The working class grew in size and visibility, and urbanization brought new challenges and opportunities. Living conditions in industrial cities were often poor, with overcrowding, pollution, and inadequate sanitation. Yet, wages gradually rose. Consumer goods became more accessible, and the growth of labor unions gave workers a stronger collective voice. The emergence of a modern middle class was another consequence of industrialization. Engineers, managers, teachers, and professionals found new roles in the expanding economy. This group valued education, stability, and upward mobility, and it often supported nationalist and imperial causes, seeing in the empire a source of pride and security. The business elite also gained influence. Industrialists and bankers became key players in national policy. They supported wealth, politic, naval expansion, and colonial ventures, not only for reasons of prestige, but also for the commercial opportunities they presented. The close relationship between the state and big business became a defining feature of the German model. The government provided contracts, tariffs, and support, while industry delivered technological and economic power. One area where Germany lagged, however, was agriculture. The eastern regions of the empire, particularly Prussia, remained dominated by large estates known as Junkergüter, controlled by the aristocratic Junker class. These estates relied on traditional farming methods and seasonal labor from poorer regions. The Junkers maintained strong political influence, especially within the Prussian Landtag and the upper echelons of the military and bureaucracy. Their conservative outlook often clashed with the demands of industrial society, but their support was essential to maintaining the social and political order. Despite these tensions, Germany's economic growth was striking. By the eve of the First World War, the empire had surpassed Britain in industrial output and ranked second globally only to the United States. It led in many scientific disciplines, held a strong trade surplus, and had accumulated significant capital reserves. The state also played a significant role in shaping economic development. Unlike the laissez-faire model favored in Britain, Germany adopted a more interventionist approach. The government invested in infrastructure, supported research, and protected domestic industries through tariffs. This collaboration between the state, academia, and industry created a uniquely coordinated system of national development. Education reform was another pillar of this success. Primary education became nearly universal, and secondary education prepared students for both university and technical careers. Germany's university system, with its focus on rigorous scholarship and specialization, attracted students and scholars from across the world. By the early 20th century, German was considered the international language of science. However, the rapid pace of change also created anxieties. Many Germans feared that traditional values were being lost, that urban life was breeding instability, and that social cohesion was under threat. These concerns fed into nationalist and conservative movements that sought to preserve what they saw as the essence of German identity. The idea of Volkschaft, or people's community, emerged as an ideal. A harmonious society united by shared heritage, duty, and loyalty to the nation. At the same time, workers began to organize more forcefully. The Social Democratic Party, though still subject to official suspicion, became one of the largest political parties in the Reich. Trade unions negotiated for better wages and conditions, and strikes became more frequent. The growth of a politicized working class introduced new pressures into the political system, which remained dominated by elites. Culturally, the period was vibrant and complex. German literature, music, philosophy, and visual arts flourished. Thinkers such as Max Weber, musicians like Richard Strauss, and artists from the Expressionist movement contributed to a rich cultural scene. There was a strong belief in progress, but also a growing sense of unease. A recognition that industrial power had created both prosperity and new vulnerabilities. In short, the German Empire of the early 20th century was a nation of extraordinary scientific achievement and industrial growth. It was a land of factories, laboratories, and innovation, but also one of inequality, social tension, and political rigidity. The dynamism of the economy could not be matched by flexibility in the political sphere. By the early 20th century, the German Empire stood at the forefront of industrial and scientific advancement. But beneath the surface of this modern success story, deep social and political tensions were beginning to challenge the foundations of the imperial system. The rapid transformation of German society through industrialization, urbanization, and education had created new demands, new voices, and new forms of political engagement. Among the most powerful of these was the rise of social democracy. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, known as the SPD, had its roots in the labor movements of the mid-9th century. Founded in the 1860s as a party representing workers and trade unions, it combined socialist ideals with calls for democratic reform. The party's platform included demands for universal suffrage, legal protections for workers, freedom of speech and assembly, and the right to organize. Though it had been repressed under Bismarck's anti-socialist laws in the 1870s and 80s, the SPD had not only survived but gained strength in the years following his resignation. As Germany's industrial cities expanded, so did the SPD's base. Workers living in crowded tenements, laboring long hours in factories, and facing uncertain futures found in the party a voice that spoke to their conditions. The SPD built an impressive political infrastructure, including newspapers, cultural associations, educational programs, and unions. These organizations helped create a distinct working-class identity and community, rooted in solidarity and political consciousness. By the turn of the 20th century, the SPD had become the largest political party in Germany in terms of voter support. In the Reichstag elections of the early 1900s, the party consistently won the highest number of votes, though not the most seats due to the unequal electoral system. The Prussian three-class franchise, which gave disproportionate voting power to the wealthy, severely limited SPD representation in state legislatures. Nonetheless, the SPD's growing popularity was impossible to ignore. The German political establishment responded to the SPD's rise with suspicion and hostility. The Kaiser, conservative elites, and much of the military viewed the party as a threat to national unity and social order. Socialists were often portrayed as unpatriotic, internationalist, and radical. Wilhelm II famously referred to them as a gang of traitors, and surveillance of socialist organizations was widespread. However, the SPD's actual strategy was more cautious than revolutionary. Influenced by thinkers like Edward Bernstein, the party gradually embraced a reformist approach, focusing on gradual change through parliamentary means rather than revolutionary upheaval. While some factions within the SPD maintained a more radical Marxist perspective, the party leadership prioritized legal participation, labor legislation, and incremental gains. This pragmatic shift helped the SPD appeal to a broader segment of the population. Teachers, clerks, and other members of the lower middle class began to see the party as a vehicle for fairness and progress. As the SPD's influence expanded, it became both a political force and a cultural institution. Its newspapers reached hundreds of thousands of readers. Its rallies drew massive crowds, and its songs and slogans became part of everyday life in working-class neighborhoods. At the same time, other political currents were also evolving. The Centre Party, representing Catholic interests, maintained strong support in southern Germany and among rural populations. Liberal parties, once dominant among the bourgeois, struggled to define their position between a conservative monarchy and a rising socialist movement. Right-winged nationalist groups began to emerge more forcefully, combining anti-socialist rhetoric with calls for military strength, imperial expansion, and ethnic unity. These shifting alignments created a fragmented political landscape. Although the Reichstag was elected by universal male suffrage, it had limited power. The real authority remained with the Kaiser and the Chancellor, who were not accountable to the Parliament. This created a fundamental contradiction in the political system. The people could vote, but they could not govern. The more the SPD grew, the more this contradiction became apparent. Large segments of the population felt politically excluded, even as they participated in the democratic process. This led to rising frustration, especially as economic conditions fluctuated. Periods of prosperity were often followed by downturns, and workers bore the brunt of instability. Strikes became more frequent, and labor disputes more intense. Women, too, began to organize and demand a voice. Although they lacked the right to vote or stand for office, women played a central role in the SPD and other reform movements. They campaigned for suffrage, education, labor rights, and protection from exploitation. Figures such as Clara Zetkin emerged as influential voices advocating both for socialism and women's emancipation. The state responded to growing unrest with a mixture of reform and repression. Some social legislation was introduced to improve working conditions, limit child labor, and regulate factory hours. However, these measures were often limited in scope and poorly enforced. Police surveillance of political activists intensified, and the army was sometimes deployed to suppress strikes. The judiciary, aligned with conservative interests, handed down harsh sentences for political offenses. At the same time, Germany's ruling elite began to embrace new forms of nationalism as a counterweight to socialism. The idea of Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, was promoted as an ideal of unity that transcended class conflict. National holidays, military parades, and imperial imagery were used to foster loyalty to the state. Organizations like the German League pushed for a more aggressive nationalism rooted in racial and cultural identity, often with anti-Semitic undertones. These efforts, however, did not resolve the underlying tensions. Germany remained a society divided between an industrialized, politically conscious working class and a conservative establishment clinging to traditional authority. The imperial government refused to undertake significant constitutional reforms that would democratize power. As a result, political pressure continued to build. Intellectuals and reformers debated the future of the empire. Some argued for gradual liberalization, fearing that repression would only fuel revolution. Others warned that Germany was heading toward a breaking point, that without meaningful change, the social fabric would tear under the weight of contradiction. By the second decade of the 20th century, the German Empire stood at a crossroads. Economically strong and culturally vibrant, it was also politically brittle and socially divided. The SPD had shown that new forces could rise within the imperial system, but the system itself had proven resistant to adaptation. The consequences of this rigidity would soon be tested, not by domestic movements alone, but by forces far beyond Germany's borders. As international crises mounted and Europe drifted toward war, the question was no longer whether Germany could reform itself, but whether it could withstand the storm that was coming. By the early years of the 20th century, the German Empire had firmly established itself as a leading industrial and military power. However, as Germany sought to translate this strength into global influence, its aggressive posture in foreign affairs began to strain relations with other major powers. Between the First Moroccan Crisis in the early 1900s and the escalating tensions in the Balkans by the eve of the First World War, a series of international incidents revealed just how fragile the European balance had become and how Germany's ambitions were contributing to the unraveling. The first major flashpoint was Morocco. In the early 20th century, Morocco remained one of the few regions in North Africa that had not yet been fully colonized by a European power. France had long shown interest in expanding its influence there, and by the early 1900s, it had reached a secret understanding with Britain, allowing for eventual control over Moroccan affairs. Germany, seeing itself increasingly sidelined in colonial matters, decided to challenge this arrangement. In the spring of 195, Kaiser Wilhelm II made a dramatic visit to the Moroccan city of Tangier. There he delivered a public speech in support of Moroccan independence and declared that Germany had interests in the region as well. His words were not just diplomatic posturing. They were a deliberate attempt to provoke a crisis and test the strength of the Franco-British understanding. The result was the First Moroccan Crisis. France, backed by Britain, refused to back down. Germany demanded an international conference to resolve the matter. The Algeciras Conference was convened in early 196, bringing together the major European powers. Although Germany hoped to divide France and Britain, the opposite occurred. The two allies stood firm, and Germany found itself isolated. The final resolution gave France a privileged role in Morocco, while offering Germany only symbolic concessions. The crisis marked a turning point in European diplomacy. It confirmed the strengthening relationship between Britain and France, and signaled that Germany's attempts to assert global influence would be met with resistance. It also deepened a sense of encirclement within German political and military circles, a belief that the empire was being unfairly constrained by jealous rivals. In response, Germany continued to build its military strength and pursued more assertive foreign policies. But tensions did not ease. Just a few years later, the Second Moroccan Crisis erupted. In 1911, France sent troops into Morocco to suppress a local uprising. Germany responded by dispatching a gunboat, the Panther, to the port of Agadir, claiming to protect German interests. This show of force alarmed Britain, which viewed the deployment as a threat to naval routes and imperial stability. The crisis nearly brought the great powers to the brink of war. Once again, Germany was forced to back down, accepting territorial compensation in Central Africa, but gaining little real influence in Morocco. Domestically, the crisis further emboldened nationalist voices who argued that Germany needed to act more decisively to protect its status. While Germany's involvement in Morocco strained Western diplomacy, an even more dangerous set of developments was unfolding in southeastern Europe. The Balkans, a region of diverse ethnic groups, weak empires, and nationalist aspirations, had long been a source of instability. The decline of Ottoman control and the ambitions of Austria, Hungary, Russia, and emerging Balkan states created a volatile environment. Austria-Hungary, Germany's closest ally, had its own imperial concerns in the Balkans. In 1988, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. territories it had administered since the Congress of Berlin in the late 19th century. This move enraged Serbia, which viewed the territories as part of a greater Serbian homeland. Russia, protector of Slavic interests, also protested but ultimately backed down after Germany voiced strong support for Austria-Hungary. This incident, known as the Bosnian Crisis, revealed the depth of Germany's commitment to its alliance with Austria-Hungary. It also heightened tensions with Russia and Serbia. Germany's willingness to stand firm against Russian pressure convinced many in Europe that the empire was increasingly aggressive and willing to support its allies regardless of the consequences. In the following years, the Balkans saw two further conflicts, the First and Second Balkan Wars. In the first, a coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, defeated the Ottoman Empire and seized territory. In the second, these former allies turned on each other over the spoils. Austria, Hungary, and Russia became increasingly involved in backing different sides, and Germany watched with concern as the region moved closer to a broader confrontation. For Germany, these crises revealed both opportunity and danger. On one hand, they allowed the empire to demonstrate its loyalty to Austria-Hungary and assert its position in European affairs. On the other hand, they underscored the risk of being dragged into a war by the actions of a smaller ally, or the volatility of nationalist movements in southeastern Europe. By this point, the European alliance system had become deeply polarized. Germany and Austria-Hungary stood together in the dual alliance, while France and Russia were tied through a military treaty. Britain, increasingly wary of Germany's naval and diplomatic behavior, had drawn closer to both. Though not formally part of a triple alliance, the understanding between Britain, France, and Russia, known as the Triple Entente, was solidifying. German military planners, especially within the General Staff, began to view war as inevitable. Strategic thinking became dominated by the need to prepare for a two-front conflict. The Schlieffen Plan, developed in the early 20th century, outlined a rapid attack on France through Belgium in the event of war, with the goal of defeating France quickly before turning east to confront Russia. This plan required precise timing, fast mobilization, and total commitment. Once launched, it left little room for diplomatic flexibility once a crisis began. Internally, the German leadership was divided. Civilian leaders often favored restraint, diplomacy, and stability. But within the military and among nationalist circles, there was growing impatience with diplomatic failure and a belief that Germany must assert itself forcefully or risk decline. The crisis of the early 20th century had convinced many that confrontation was not only possible, it was necessary. At the same time, public opinion was being shaped by nationalist rhetoric and a press that often portrayed Germany as encircled by enemies and denied its rightful place in the world. Naval leagues, patriotic associations, and nationalist publications encouraged the view that Germany must stand firm and prepare for conflict. A sense of destiny combined with grievance was building across the empire. By the summer of 1914, Europe was a continent tightly bound by alliances, driven by nationalism, armed with vast militaries, and led by governments often more fearful of appearing weak than of going to war. Germany, through its assertive foreign policy, its unwavering support for Austria-Hungary, and its military planning, had become a central player in this dangerous environment. The crises of Morocco and the Balkans had not caused a general war, but they had changed the political and psychological landscape of Europe. They had tested alliances, inflamed rivalries, and narrowed the space for diplomacy. The next crisis would not be diffused. The spark would come not from Berlin, Paris, or London, but from Sivo through the hand of a young assassin whose actions would set the world on fire. On a quiet Sunday morning in late June of the year 1914, a shot was fired in Sivo that would echo across continents. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, marked the moment when years of diplomatic tension, nationalist rivalry, and military preparation converged into irreversible conflict. But while the act itself was carried out by a Bosnian Serb nationalist, the chain of decisions that followed, especially those made in Berlin, turned a regional crisis into a global war. Central among those decisions was what came to be known as Germany's blank check. Franz Ferdinand had travelled to Sarajevo to observe military exercises and assert imperial presence in Bosnia-Herzegovina, a region annexed by Austria-Hungary a few years earlier. His assassination, carried out by Gabrielo Princip, a 19-year-old member of the nationalist group Young Bosnia, was intended as a blow against imperial domination and in support of greater Serbian unity. While the murder was shocking, political assassinations were not new to Europe. What set this one apart was the response it provoked and the role that Germany played in encouraging that response. In Vienna, leaders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire saw the assassination not only as a personal tragedy, but as a direct challenge to imperial authority. The empire had been struggling with internal ethnic tensions and growing Serbian influence in the Balkans. Many in the government and military believed that the time had come to deal decisively with Serbia, which they suspected of supporting the assassins. But Austria-Hungary could not act alone. Any military action against Serbia risked drawing in Russia, which had positioned itself as protector of Slavic nations in the region. Vienna's leaders turned to their closest ally, Germany, for support. What they sought was reassurance that Germany would stand by them in the event that war expanded beyond the Balkans. Germany's leadership responded with unambiguous backing. In early July, just days after the assassination, the German ambassador in Vienna conveyed a message from Berlin. Germany would support Austria-Hungary no matter what course of action it chose. This assurance, given without conditions or limitations, became known as the blank check. Why did Germany offer such unqualified support? Several factors were at play. First, the German leadership, particularly the military and foreign policy elite, believed that a conflict with Russia and its allies was becoming increasingly likely. They viewed Serbia as a proxy for Russian influence and saw a confrontation in the Balkans as both inevitable and strategically necessary. Second, there was a sense that time was not on Germany's side. Russia's military was growing in strength, and some German generals believed that war would be more winnable now than in a few years. Kaiser Wilhelm II himself played a complex role, initially supportive of Austria's hardline stance. He later appeared to hesitate, suggesting that Serbia's response to Austria's demands could be sufficient to avoid war. However, by then, German officials, particularly Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann, Hollweg, and key military leaders, had already made clear their commitment to backing Austria to the end. With German support secured, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia on the 23rd of July. The terms were deliberately harsh, including demands that Serbia suppress nationalist propaganda, dissolve nationalist organizations, and allow Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in investigations within Serbia. Though Serbia agreed to most of the conditions, it rejected those that compromised its sovereignty. Vienna declared the response unsatisfactory and on the 28th of July declared war on Serbia. Russia, bound by its role as Serbia's protector and wary of Austro-Hungarian ambitions in the Balkans, began mobilizing its forces. Germany, interpreting Russian mobilization as a direct threat, declared war on Russia on the 1st of August. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France, which was allied with Russia through a military treaty. To implement its war strategy, Germany invoked the Schlieffen Plan, which called for a rapid strike through neutral Belgium to encircle and defeat France before turning east to face Russia. This invasion of Belgium on the 4th of August triggered Britain's entry into the war. Although Britain was not bound by any formal alliance with France or Russia, it had long guaranteed Belgian neutrality. The violation of that neutrality provided both the legal pretext and the moral justification for Britain to declare war on Germany. Within the span of a few weeks, what had begun as a regional dispute between Austria, Hungary, and Serbia escalated into a general European war. At the center of this escalation stood the German Empire, its leaders convinced that their national survival and prestige depended on swift and decisive action. The decision-making process in Berlin during this period remains one of the most studied and debated episodes in modern history. While it is clear that Germany did not plan the assassination and may not have wanted a general European war at that moment, it is equally clear that German leaders took calculated risks. They provided Austria-Hungary with a green light to act aggressively, failed to restrain their ally when restraint was still possible, and committed to a war strategy that required immediate and total mobilization. In issuing the blank check, Germany hoped to preserve its alliance system, maintain credibility, and perhaps achieve a strategic advantage before its rivals could catch up. What it underestimated was the scale of the reaction it would provoke and the resilience of the opposing coalition. The German public, for the most part, rallied behind the government when war broke out. Nationalist fervor swept through cities with crowds, cheering departing soldiers and newspapers proclaiming a righteous struggle. Many believed the war would be short, a matter of weeks or months. The government, who expected a quick victory based on the precision of its military planning and the power of its army. Yet behind the optimism lay a grim reality. The war that Germany had helped unleash was not the limited conflict of previous European crises. It was a war involving the world's largest empires, fought with modern weapons and mass armies. It would not be decided by clever diplomacy or swift campaigns, but by attrition, sacrifice, and endurance. Germany's role in the July crisis was not that of an innocent bystander drawn into conflict against its will. Rather, it was an active participant in escalating the crisis, motivated by a combination of strategic calculation, alliance obligations, and fear of encirclement. The blank check was both a diplomatic blunder and a reflection of deeper structural pressures within the empire. As German troops crossed into Belgium and France and Russian forces advanced on the Eastern Front, the stage was set for a war unlike any the world had seen before. The German Empire, confident in its strength and sure of its purpose, was now fully committed. But the cost of that commitment would soon become apparent in blood, in hardship, and eventually in the very survival of the empire itself. As the sun rose on the first days of August in the year 1914, Germany stood on the threshold of a war that would engulf not just Europe, but much of the world. The calculated assurances of the July crisis had transformed into irreversible action. Mobilization orders were issued, railway timetables activated, and soldiers dispatched to frontiers. The great powers of Europe, locked in alliance commitments and strategic doctrines, now moved from diplomatic maneuvering to military engagement. Germany, confident in its preparation and driven by the belief that speed would determine victory, set its vast war machine into motion. Germany's strategic plan for war, developed by General Count Alfred von Schlieffen and refined by his successors, was built on the expectation that Germany would face a two-front conflict against France in the west and Russia in the east. The plan was predicated on defeating France quickly, ideally within a matter of weeks before Russia could fully mobilize its forces. The assumption was that speed, decisiveness, and overwhelming force would secure victory. To do this, the German army would bypass France's heavily fortified eastern border by invading through neutral Belgium and Luxembourg, sweeping westward in a wide arc toward Paris. Once France was subdued, German forces would be transported by rail to the Eastern Front to confront Russia. It was a bold plan that relied on precise timing, logistical mastery, and the assumption that Britain would remain neutral or at least delay its entry into the war. On the 4th of August, German troops crossed into Belgium. The invasion violated international treaties that guaranteed Belgian neutrality. Most notably, the Treaty of London, signed decades earlier, to which Britain was a guarantor. The German government downplayed the violation, describing the treaty as a mere scrap of paper, a phrase attributed to Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hallwig. But to Britain, the breach was both a moral and strategic affront. That same day, Britain declared war on Germany. Germany now faced what Bismarck had worked so carefully to avoid, a war on multiple fronts against a coalition of major powers: France, Russia, and Britain, each with vast resources and global reach. What had begun as a Balkan crisis had become a European war, and Germany was at its center. The early stages of the war unfolded with both brutal efficiency and tragic miscalculation. German forces advanced rapidly through Belgium, encountering stiff resistance in cities such as Leesky and Namur. The German army, though disciplined and well supplied, met fierce opposition from the Belgian army and local populations. Civilians were sometimes accused of being irregular combatants, and reprisals followed. In towns like Leuven and Dont, German troops committed atrocities that shocked world opinion, burning buildings, executing civilians, and destroying cultural landmarks. These actions, widely reported in Allied newspapers, contributed to Germany's growing reputation as an aggressor. The idea of German militarism became a central theme in Allied propaganda. The invasion of Belgium, intended as a tactical shortcut, had instead provoked global condemnation and brought Britain decisively into the war. Despite these complications, the German advance continued. By early September, German armies were within striking distance of Paris. The French army, reeling from earlier defeats, was pushed back across the Marne River. It seemed for a moment that the Schlieffen plan might succeed, that France would fall quickly, as anticipated. But the plan had overestimated the ability of Germany's right flank to maintain its speed and strength. Extended supply lines, exhaustion, and logistical errors began to take their toll. Crucially, the French army under General Joseph Joffre regrouped and launched a counteroffensive. At the First Battle of the Marne, reinforced by British forces arriving from the Channel, the Allies halted the German advance. A gap opened between German armies and the offensive lost momentum. The German High Command, recognizing the danger of overextension, ordered a retreat to more defensible positions. The attempt to knock France out of the war in a single rapid campaign had failed. The war would not end in a matter of weeks. It was now destined to become a long, grinding conflict. In the east, the situation evolved differently. Russia had mobilized more quickly than expected and launched an invasion of East Prussia. German commanders Erich Ludendorff and Paul Fontainebleau led a swift and decisive response at the Battle of Tannenberg in late August. The Russian Second Army was encircled and destroyed with tens of thousands taken prisoner. It was a spectacular victory that boosted German morale and made Hindenburg a national hero. But the Eastern Front would remain active and costly, requiring continuous attention and diverting resources from the Western campaign. On both fronts, the war quickly outgrew the assumptions that had shaped its initial strategies. The German army, designed for short wars of movement, now faced entrenched resistance. In the west, a race to the sea followed as both sides attempted to outflank each other. This maneuvering ended in a stalemate, with both German and Allied forces digging deep trenches from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Trench warfare brought a new and horrifying dimension to the conflict. Conditions were brutal. Mud, rats, disease, and constant shelling became the soldiers' daily reality. Artillery barges devastated the landscape, while barbed wire, machine guns, and poisoned gas made advances deadly and short-lived. The Western Front became a static, attritional battlefield, one where gains were measured in meters and paid for with thousands of lives. For Germany, the failure of the Schlieffen Plan marked a turning point. The dream of a swift and decisive victory evaporated. The empire now faced a prolonged war requiring total mobilization of society and economy. The German government introduced rationing, redirected industrial production toward armaments, and imposed censorship. Civil liberties were curtailed in the name of national security. At the same time, the German leadership tried to maintain public morale through propaganda and patriotic appeals. The war was portrayed as a defensive struggle against encirclement, a battle to preserve German culture and honor. Despite mounting casualties, many Germans continued to believe in the justice of their cause. At least in the early years of the war, the burden of war also began to affect German alliances. Austria-Hungary, though supported by Germany, struggled to contain Russian and Serbian forces. The Ottoman Empire, encouraged by German diplomats and military advisors, entered the war on the side of the Central Powers in late October. This expanded the war's scope and introduced new fronts in the Middle East and the Caucasus. Germany's naval strategy also began to evolve. Recognizing its fleet could not match Britain's Royal Navy in a direct confrontation, Germany turned to submarine warfare. U-boat targeted Allied shipping, aiming to cut off supplies and weaken Britain's war effort. This tactic would have major consequences in later stages of the war, especially with regard to neutral powers. By the end of the year 1914, it was clear that the war would not be over by Christmas as many had hoped. Instead, Germany was locked in a massive multi-front conflict with no clear end in sight. The cost in human lives was already staggering. The social and economic structures of the empire were under strain. Yet the leadership remained committed to victory, believing that German strength, discipline, and industrial capacity could still bring triumph. What had begun as a swift military gamble had become a war of endurance. Germany, having launched its armies with confidence and resolve, now faced a new and far more uncertain struggle, one that would test not just its military but the very fabric of the empire itself. By the close of the year 1914, the German Empire had failed to achieve its swift victory on the Western Front. The Schlieffen Plan had broken down, and the war that was supposed to be decided in a matter of weeks had instead entered a new grueling phase. Both sides, Germany and the Allied powers, settled into defensive positions that would define the Western Front for the next 4 years. What followed was not movement, but stagnation. It was a war of endurance defined by trenches, artillery, and unrelenting suffering. The German retreat after the Battle of the Mn brought an end to open maneuver and marked the beginning of entrenchment. As German forces dug in to defend their positions, the Allies did the same. From the North Sea coast of Belgium down to the Swiss frontier, a continuous line of defensive trenches stretched across Western Europe. Neither side would manage to break this line decisively for the remainder of the war. The trench systems were complex and evolving. At first, they were simple ditches intended to provide cover from enemy fire, but over time they became more elaborate. German trenches in particular were often more robust than those of their enemies. Built with reinforced dugouts, underground bunkers, communication lines, and firing positions, these defensive works were designed to hold ground indefinitely. Behind the front lines, Germany constructed multiple layers of defense, including support trenches and reserve positions. Life in the trenches was harsh and punishing. Soldiers lived with mud, vermin, and constant threat. The weather, particularly during winter, turned the ground into thick, clinging sludge that filled boots, soaked clothing, and collapsed dugouts. Hygiene was minimal. Lice were endemic, and diseases such as trenchant and dysentery spread quickly. Food was often limited and monotonous. Mail from home and brief moments of calm became rare sources of comfort. German soldiers on the Western Front adapted as best they could. Many developed routines to cope with the daily dangers of snipers, shell fire, and surprise raids. They built shelters from salvaged materials, created trench art to pass the time, and maintained discipline through drill and camaraderie. Letters and diaries from German troops reveal a range of emotions: duty, fear, hope, despair, all set against the background of a war that increasingly made little sense. The strategy of both sides during this period became one of attrition. The attempt to wear down the enemy through sustained losses. Battles were often launched with limited territorial objectives, but immense costs in human life. One of the most infamous examples was the Battle of Verdun in the year 1916, launched by the German army. The offensive was intended to bleed France white to force the French into a costly defense of a symbolically important position. For nearly a year, German and French forces clashed around the fortresses of Verdun. The Germans employed massive artillery bombardments, including gas shells, followed by waves of infantry assaults. The French responded with equally intense counterattacks. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The battle achieved no decisive strategic breakthrough, but it left an enduring mark on all who fought there. For Germany, Verdun consumed vast resources and manpower, ultimately forcing a withdrawal to original lines. That same year, the Allies launched the Battle of the Somme. This Anglo-French offensive, intended in part to relieve pressure on Verdun, turned into one of the bloodiest battles in human history. On the first day alone, British forces suffered tens of thousands of casualties. German defenders, though dug in and well supplied, also endured enormous losses. The German army demonstrated tactical flexibility by shifting reserves and reinforcing key positions quickly. Yet, the relentless shelling and assaults wore down even the most experienced troops. These battles highlight the central problem of trench warfare. Massive offensives often resulted in minimal territorial gains. Technological advancements had outpaced traditional tactics. Artillery and machine guns dominated the battlefield, while communication and mobility lagged behind. Each attack required weeks of planning and vast quantities of ammunition, but rarely shifted the front lines significantly. To adapt, German commanders began exploring new tactics. In the later stages of the war, they developed infiltration techniques using small units of specially trained soldiers, known as stormtroopers, to penetrate enemy lines, bypass strong points, and disrupt rear areas. These methods would later influence modern combined arms warfare. But during the trench years, their impact was limited by the scale of operations and the exhaustion of available resources. The air war also began to take shape during this period. Initially used for reconnaissance, aircraft evolved into tools of both observation and combat. German pilots such as Manfred von Richthofen, known as the Red Baron, became legendary figures, their exploits celebrated by a public eager for heroes. Yet even in the skies, the war was one of attrition. Planes were fragile, engines unreliable, and survival rates low. Behind the lines, the German Empire mobilized its entire society for war. Industry was reorganized to prioritize munitions and military equipment. The Hindenburg program, introduced in the year 1916, aimed to double armaments production through state planning and labor conscription. Civilian goods became scarce and food shortages began to take a serious toll. The British naval blockade restricted imports of grain and other essentials, leading to malnutrition and unrest on the home front. Morale at the front and at home began to deteriorate. In the early years of the war, nationalist enthusiasm had been widespread. But by the time trench warfare had become the norm, the realities of prolonged conflict were impossible to ignore. News of mass casualties, economic hardship, and the absence of a clear path to victory fed public discontent. Protests and strikes, though initially limited, began to emerge. The social consequences were significant. The authority of the Kaiser and the traditional elites was increasingly questioned. The Social Democratic Party, which had initially supported war credits in a show of national unity, began to fracture. More radical voices gained support, calling for peace, democratic reform, and worker control. Soldiers on leave brought back grim accounts of the front, further eroding the government's image. Within the German army, discipline remained strict, but the psychological strain was immense. Shell shock, what today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected thousands. Letters from the front often conveyed a longing for peace and a sense of alienation from the military leadership. Nevertheless, most soldiers continued to fight, bound by duty, habit, and the fear of punishment. Germany's high command, led by General Paul von Hindenburg and his deputy Erich Ludendorff, continued to believe that victory was possible through military means. Their focus remained on achieving a decisive breakthrough either on the Western Front or elsewhere. Yet the longer the war dragged on, the more this belief seemed detached from reality. The empire was bleeding slowly, steadily, and seemingly without end. The trenches of the Western Front symbolized more than just a military stalemate. They reflected the paralysis of a political system unable to adapt, a society stretched beyond its limits, and a generation caught in a conflict it could neither escape nor fully understand. For Germany, the trenches were both a battlefield and a prison, a place where dreams of glory had given way to mud, blood, and a grim determination to survive. While trench warfare defined much of the struggle on the Western Front, the First World War was also fought across oceans and continents. For the German Empire, the war at sea and in its colonial holdings represented both an extension of its global ambitions and a test of its military reach. These theaters of war, often overlooked in the larger narrative, played a crucial role in shaping the empire's strategy, its relations with other powers, and its eventual downfall. At the heart of Germany's maritime strategy was its navy, which had been dramatically expanded in the years leading up to the war. The ambition behind this build-up had been to challenge the dominance of the British Royal Navy and to assert Germany's status as a world power. However, by the time war broke out in the summer of the year 1914, the German Navy was still smaller and less experienced than its British counterpart. Early in the conflict, the German surface fleet, based in the North Sea at ports such as Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, adopted a cautious posture. The Royal Navy had established a blockade of the North Sea, cutting off Germany's access to international trade. Rather than risk a direct confrontation, the German High Seas Fleet largely remained in port, preserving its strength for a future decisive engagement. The British Grand Fleet, meanwhile, maintained a constant presence, tightening the economic stranglehold on Germany. Although the surface fleet saw limited action, German naval forces were active in other areas. One of the most famous early engagements occurred in the South Atlantic at the Battle of Coronel in November of the year 1914. A German squadron under Admiral Maximilian von Spee surprised and defeated a British force off the coast of Chile, sinking to cruisers. It was a rare German victory at sea and a boost to national morale. However, the triumph was short-lived. A month later, at the Battle of the Falkland Islands, a reinforced British fleet hunted down and destroyed Van Pee's squadron. The loss of these ships, along with their experienced crews, marked the end of Germany's serious surface naval operations outside European waters. As Germany's surface fleet faced containment, the Navy turned increasingly to submarine warfare. German U-boot, short for undersea BHA, represented a new and formidable threat. These submarines could operate stealthily, striking merchant and military vessels without warning. Their goal was to disrupt British supply lines and weaken the Allied war effort by cutting off food, weapons, and raw materials. In the early years of the war, German submarines scored notable successes. Merchant ships were sunk in increasing numbers, and the psychological impact on Allied shipping and coastal populations was significant. However, submarine warfare also carried enormous diplomatic risks, particularly when neutral ships were targeted. One of the most consequential incidents occurred in May of the year 1915, when the British passenger liner Lusitania was sunk off the coast of Ireland by a German U-boot. Nearly 1,200 people died, including over 100 American citizens. The sinking of the Lusitania triggered international outrage, particularly in the United States. Although the ship had been carrying war materials, the loss of civilian lives led to intense diplomatic pressure on Germany to restrict its submarine campaign. For a time, the German government agreed to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare, fearing that American entry into the war would tip the balance against the Central Powers. Still, the strategic value of submarines remained undeniable. By the year 1917, Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, believing that it could force Britain into surrender before American intervention became decisive. This decision would have profound consequences as it contributed directly to the United States declaration of war against Germany in April of that year. Beyond Europe and the seas, Germany's overseas colonies also became battlegrounds. Although the empire's colonial holdings were relatively modest compared to those of Britain or France, they were nonetheless significant symbols of national prestige and global reach. The colonies included German East Africa, present-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi; German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, Togoland, Cameroon, and various islands in the Pacific and China. At the outbreak of the war, most of these colonies were quickly overrun by Allied forces. In Africa, British, French, Belgian, and South African troops launched coordinated invasions. Togond, with its strategic wireless station at Kamina, was captured within weeks. German Southwest Africa was invaded by troops from the Union of South Africa, which was itself a British dominion. Despite initial resistance, German forces there surrendered in mid-1915. Cameroon posed more of a challenge. German troops, supported by local African forces and using the difficult terrain to their advantage, managed to resist Allied advances for over a year. However, by early 1916, they too were forced to surrender after a prolonged campaign. The most remarkable colonial defense came in German East Africa, under the command of General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, a career officer with a reputation for discipline and unconventional tactics. Lettow-Vorbeck waged a guerrilla war against superior Allied forces. He utilized mobility, local knowledge, and the support of indigenous Askari troops to keep the campaign going long after Germany had lost control of other colonies. Remarkably, he remained undefeated in the field and only surrendered in November of the year 1918 after receiving news of the armistice in Europe. In the Pacific, Japan, an ally of Britain, quickly seized Germany's holdings in China, including the port city of Qingdao, and occupied several German-controlled islands. Australian and New Zealand forces took control of German Samoa and other territories. The fall of these colonies marked the end of Germany's brief presence in East Asia and the Pacific. The loss of the colonial empire had limited economic impact on Germany during the war, as these territories had not yet been deeply integrated into the imperial economy. However, the psychological and symbolic blow was significant. The colonies had been presented as a measure of Germany's global power. Their loss signaled a retreat from that vision and weakened the narrative of imperial prestige that had underpinned world politics. Moreover, the war at sea and in the colonies demonstrated the global scale of the conflict. German civilians, long accustomed to thinking of war as something distant or contained, began to experience the full reach of total war. The British naval blockade, tightened year after year, brought hunger and deprivation to the German home front. Imports of food, fertilizers, and raw materials fell sharply, and the population began to suffer from malnutrition and disease. In response, the German government attempted to organize domestic production and ration supplies. Substitute goods, called ersatz products, became commonplace. Bread made from potato flour, coffee from roasted barley, and synthetic rubber were all used to compensate for shortages. But these measures could not fully offset the impact of the blockade or the strain of a prolonged war effort. In the end, the naval war and colonial campaigns revealed the limitations of Germany's global reach. Despite technological innovation and bold tactics, the empire lacked the resources, alliances, and strategic depth to challenge the maritime supremacy of Britain or maintain a global empire in the face of overwhelming opposition. What Germany did achieve, however, was to redefine the nature of naval and colonial warfare. Submarine tactics would influence naval strategy for decades to come, while the legacy of colonial resistance, particularly in German East Africa, highlighted the complex and often overlooked dimensions of the war outside Europe. While the Western Front had stagnated in the mud and blood of trench warfare, the Eastern Front offered a very different kind of conflict, marked by vast distances, sweeping offensives, and rapidly shifting front lines. For the German Empire, the war in the East not only brought dramatic military victories, but also opened the door to one of the most consequential political developments of the entire conflict: the collapse of the Russian Empire and the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. From the earliest months of the war, Germany faced a dual challenge to hold its western positions while pushing back Russian advances in the east. Although the Russian army had mobilized faster than anticipated, it lacked modern equipment, efficient logistics, and unified command. German forces under the command of General Paul von Hindenburg and his deputy Erich Ludendorff responded swiftly. In the summer of the year 1914, they achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Tannenberg, encircling and destroying a Russian army in East Prussia. This early success set the tone for Germany's eastern campaign. Unlike the Western Front, where fortified lines prevented large-scale movement, the Eastern Front allowed for greater maneuverability. Germany and its ally Austria-Hungary launched a series of coordinated offensives aimed at pushing Russian forces out of Poland, Galicia, and the Baltic territories. By the year 1915, the Central Powers had recaptured large swaths of territory. German armies advanced deep into Russian-controlled lands, capturing cities such as Warsaw and Vilnius. They established military administrations to govern the occupied regions, which included parts of modern-day Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarus. German planners even began considering long-term colonization and Germanization of these territories, a vision that revealed the imperial ambitions behind the military operations. Yet, despite these victories, the Eastern War was far from easy. The scale of the conflict was enormous. The front stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian Mountains in the south. Roads and railways were few, and weather conditions were often extreme. Supplying troops across such a wide and underdeveloped theater posed serious challenges. Still, the German army proved adaptable. They made effective use of rail transport to shift forces quickly and coordinated with Austria-Hungarian units, despite increasing frustration with their allies. Lackluster performance. German commanders frequently had to step in to stabilize Austro-Hungarian lines or take over entire sectors. As the war dragged on, internal pressures began to fracture the Russian Empire. The Tsarist government, already weakened by political stagnation and social inequality, struggled to maintain order. Military defeats, economic collapse, and widespread hunger eroded public confidence. Strikes and protests multiplied and mutinies spread within the army. By early 1917, the crisis reached a breaking point. In March of that year, according to the Gregorian calendar, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated following a wave of mass protests and a general uprising in Petrograd. A provisional government, composed of liberal and moderate socialist leaders, took power and pledged to continue the war. However, it lacked legitimacy among the people and failed to address the underlying social and economic grievances. Later that year, in November, the Bolsheviks, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a second, more radical revolution. The new regime immediately announced its intention to end Russia's participation in the war. Lenin, who had returned to Russia earlier in the year with the assistance of German operatives, saw peace as essential to consolidating Bolshevik power. His famous slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," resonated with a population desperate for relief. Negotiations between Germany and Soviet Russia began in the city of Brest-Litovsk in December of the year 1917. The talks revealed a profound divide. The Germans, in a position of military superiority, demanded substantial territorial concessions. The Bolsheviks, while eager for peace, sought to delay or minimize these losses. Initially, the Soviets attempted to stall by adopting a strategy of no war, no peace, hoping revolutionary uprisings in Germany or elsewhere would shift the balance. But in February of the year 1918, Germany resumed its offensive, advancing swiftly into undefended Russian territory. Faced with the collapse of what remained of the Russian front, the Bolsheviks relented. On the 3rd of March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed. It was a humiliating agreement for Soviet Russia, which lost vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and parts of the Caucasus. These regions contained rich agricultural lands, vital industrial centers, and millions of inhabitants. The treaty effectively removed Russia from the war, allowing Germany to shift its military focus back to the west. For the German Empire, Brest-Litovsk appeared to be a monumental victory. Not only had Germany knocked out one of the major Allied powers, but it also gained access to significant resources. Ukraine in particular was seen as a potential breadbasket for the war-starved German population. German forces quickly moved in to occupy and administer these new territories. However, administering this vast and volatile region proved difficult. Local resistance, political instability, and logistical problems plagued German efforts. While puppet governments were established and German officials took charge of resource extraction, control remained tenuous. The war-torn countryside was rife with banditry, rebellion, and famine. Ukrainian nationalists, Bolshevik partisans, and other factions contested German authority at every turn. Moreover, the treaty exacerbated tensions within Germany itself. While conservatives and nationalists hailed the gains as a validation of imperial strength, socialists and moderates criticized the harsh terms imposed on the Russians. Some feared that Germany's imperial overreach in the east would provoke further resistance and moral backlash. Internationally, the treaty alarmed the remaining Allied powers. Britain, France, and the United States saw it as evidence of German aggression and expansionism. In the eyes of many, it confirmed that Germany sought not just victory, but hegemony in Europe. This perception hardened Allied resolve and justified continued fighting. Even as German leaders hoped the collapse of Russia would allow for a negotiated peace in the West. In truth, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a Pyrrhic victory. Although it removed a major enemy and granted Germany short-term advantages, it did not end the war. The United States had entered the conflict months earlier, bringing fresh troops and resources to the exhausted Western Front. German hopes of winning the war before American forces arrived in full strength would soon be tested in the spring offensives of 1918. The Eastern Front, once seen as Germany's opportunity for expansion and dominance, had instead become a cautionary tale of overreach. The empire's ambition to reshape Eastern Europe had outpaced its ability to govern, and its brutal policies alienated many of the local populations it hoped to control. Still, the war in the East had reshaped the geopolitical map. The Russian Empire had collapsed, and in its place, a new revolutionary state had emerged, one that would eventually pose an even greater challenge to Germany and Europe as a whole. For now, however, the German Empire turned its eyes westward, hoping that victory on the battlefield might still be within reach. As German forces dug deeper into the war effort on multiple fronts, another quieter battle was being fought within the borders of the empire itself. A battle of hunger, exhaustion, and growing discontent. By the time the year 1915 gave way to 1916, the German home front was undergoing a transformation as severe and consequential as any occurring on the battlefield. Total war demanded total mobilization, and the strain on German society soon became visible in every aspect of daily life. At the beginning of the war, Many Germans had believed that the conflict would be short. There had been patriotic parades, waving flags, and enthusiastic crowds sending soldiers off to war. Yet, as months turned into years, and victory remained elusive, the reality of prolonged warfare began to set in. Germany's economy, food supply, and social stability were all deeply affected by the demands of industrial-scale war. One of the most significant causes of hardship on the home front was the British naval blockade, enforced with increasing effectiveness. The blockade aimed to cut off Germany's access to global trade, including foodstuffs, raw materials, and fertilizers. This strategy was not aimed at defeating Germany militarily, but at breaking its internal capacity to sustain the war effort. Germany had relied heavily on imports before the war, particularly for food and chemical fertilizers that supported its agriculture. As the blockade tightened, the supply of imported food decreased sharply and domestic production struggled to compensate. Fields were underutilized due to the absence of male laborers who had been drafted into the army. Horses, essential for plowing, were requisitioned by the military. Fertilizers diverted for explosives manufacturing became scarce. The result was a steady decline in agricultural output. To manage the growing crisis, the German government established the Kriegsmarines War Food Office, tasked with controlling the distribution of food and rationing supplies. A system of food stamps and quotas was implemented. Initially, these measures seemed promising. However, bureaucratic inefficiency, regional disparities, and black market activity undermined the system's effectiveness. Many urban households found themselves relying on thin rations of bread, margarine, and ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Perhaps the most infamous period of civilian suffering came during the winter of 1916 to 1917, later known as the Turnip Winter. A poor harvest, combined with disrupted transportation and harsh weather, led to severe food shortages. Potatoes, the staple of the German diet, rotted in storage or failed to grow in sufficient quantities. Turnips, usually reserved for animal feed, were substituted for almost everything: breads, soups, and even desserts. The name Turnip Winter became synonymous with misery. Malnutrition spread rapidly, especially among children and the elderly. Public health deteriorated. Cases of tuberculosis, rickets, and influenza surged in crowded cities. Mothers waited in long queues for hours, sometimes only to receive meager portions. Food riots broke out in several towns. The morale of the civilian population, already strained, began to collapse. Despite the shortages, the German state continued to demand total commitment from its people. The Hindenburg program, introduced in the autumn of 1916, sought to double war production by mobilizing all available labor and resources. Named after Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, the program placed enormous pressure on both industry and the working class. Workers were drafted into arms factories. Women took on jobs previously closed to them, and prisoners of war were used as forced labor. Industrial output in sectors like steel, coal, and armaments increased, but at great cost. Working conditions were harsh. Hours were long, and wages failed to keep pace with inflation. Strikes once rare in wartime began to occur with increasing frequency. In Berlin, Hamburg, and the RAI workers protested food shortages, poor pay, and the lack of political representation. Though most strikes were contained, they revealed a growing fracture in the wartime consensus. These frustrations extended beyond the factory floor. Political tensions also intensified. The Social Democratic Party, which had initially supported war credits, now found itself divided. A more radical faction broke away to form the Independent Social Democratic Party, calling for an immediate end to the war and more democratic reforms. Anti-war sentiment, long suppressed, began to surface in speeches, pamphlets, and underground newspapers among the middle classes, too. Anxiety grew. The war had eroded savings and disrupted careers. Professionals and small business owners found themselves unable to maintain their pre-war standards of living. The illusion of unity between social classes promoted in the early stages of the war was crumbling. The promise that sacrifice would be rewarded with victory seemed more remote with each passing month. Women who bore much of the burden on the home front became increasingly visible in public life. They worked in munitions factories, served as nurses, and managed households under conditions of scarcity. While their labor was essential, their voices remained largely excluded from political decision-making. Still, women's wartime contributions laid the groundwork for post-war demands for suffrage and equality. Youth, too, were affected. With fathers at the front and schools disrupted, many young Germans grew up in a world defined by absence and austerity. Stories of hunger, air raids, and lost brothers became part of their daily lives. The romanticism of war, so prominent in the early patriotic education campaigns, was replaced by a more somber understanding of its costs. Religious and charitable organizations tried to ease the suffering. Soup kitchens, relief funds, and communal gardens were organized in many cities. But such efforts, while helpful, could not offset the systemic shortages and inefficiencies of wartime administration. Trust in institutions declined, and rumors of hoarding and corruption circulated widely. The German leadership, particularly the military command under Hindenburg and Ludendorff, remained focused on achieving military victory. They viewed home front difficulties as unfortunate but necessary sacrifices. Calls for peace were dismissed as defaced. The government introduced laws to suppress dissent and control the press. Censorship intensified. Critics were labeled traitors. Surveillance expanded. Yet, even within the military, signs of strain were visible. Letters from soldiers on the front increasingly expressed concern for their families back home. The knowledge that their children were going hungry while they fought in freezing trenches eroded morale. Desertions and psychological breakdowns became more common. As the war dragged into its fourth year, the German Empire was still standing, but under enormous internal pressure. The social contract between ruler and ruled was unraveling. The monarchy, once seen as a symbol of national unity, appeared distant and indifferent. Kaiser Wilhelm II, already sidelined in military decision-making, retreated further from public life. The belief that the war was being fought for honor, security, or justice was giving way to the stark realization that it was being endured simply to survive. The turn-up winter marked a turning point in the relationship between the German state and its people. It exposed the fragility of the imperial system when confronted with total war. It revealed how vulnerable even a powerful nation could become when cut off from the global economy, and it sowed the seeds of political radicalism, class resentment, and civil unrest that would erupt more forcefully in the final year of the war. As spring returned in the year 1917, the physical hardships of winter eased slightly, but the deeper wounds of hunger, grief, and political betrayal remained. The home front was no longer a passive rear. It had become an active front in its own right, one that would shape the fate of the empire in the months ahead. The German military leadership, recognizing that time was running out, now turned to a final gamble, a massive offensive in the West, made possible by the defeat of Russia and the redeployment of troops from the Eastern Front. It was a last attempt to break the stalemate, win the war, and silence dissent at home. The fate of the German Empire would now be decided not in conference rooms or diplomatic missions, but in the trenches on the fields of France. By the beginning of the year 1918, the German Empire was approaching a critical threshold. After more than 3 years of total war, the strain on both the military and the civilian population had become severe. Yet, Germany's leaders saw a fleeting window of opportunity. Russia had exited the war following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, freeing up hundreds of thousands of German soldiers from the Eastern Front. The United States had declared war on Germany the year before, but its forces were not yet fully mobilized in Europe. If a decisive blow could be struck in the West, Germany might still win the war, or at least secure a favorable peace. This belief shaped the decision to launch a massive offensive on the Western Front in the spring of that year. Known to the Germans as the Kaisers' Battle, and to historians as the Spring Offensive, it was a final, desperate gamble by the German High Command. Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff knew that time was not on Germany's side. Morale was collapsing at home. Resources were dwindling, and the Allies would only grow stronger with the full entry of American troops. The offensive had to succeed quickly or risk total failure. The German strategy was based on surprise, mobility, and concentrated force. The aim was to break through the Allied lines before they could react, divide British and French forces, and push toward Paris to execute this plan. Germany concentrated nearly 50 divisions and thousands of artillery pieces along a narrow section of the front in northern France. These troops had been drawn from the now quiet Eastern Front and included specially trained stormtrooper units, equipped and instructed in infiltration tactics. On the 21st of March, German artillery opened one of the largest bombardments of the entire war. Over several hours, millions of shells rained down on British positions along the Somme. Then the infantry attacked. Faster-moving shock troops bypassed strong points, infiltrated trenches, and disrupted rear areas. The British lines were overwhelmed in many sectors. The initial German gains were astonishing. In a matter of days, they advanced more than 30 miles, an achievement unheard of since the early months of the war. This first phase of the offensive, known as Operation Michael, was followed by a series of subsequent attacks along other parts of the front. Operation Georgette in Flanders, Operation Blucher, York near the A River, and others. Each was designed to keep the Allies off balance, exploit weaknesses, and create momentum. For a brief period, it seemed as if Germany might break through entirely, but the success was deceptive. The rapid advance stretched German supply lines to their limit. Roads and railways behind the front could not keep pace with the moving troops. Rations, ammunition, and reinforcements arrived late or not at all. German soldiers, exhausted and underfed after years of war and a harsh winter, began looting abandoned Allied supply depots rather than pressing forward. The advance slowed. Moreover, the gains came at a staggering cost. German casualties during the spring offensive were immense, estimated in the hundreds of thousands. These were losses Germany could not afford. The army was already struggling with manpower shortages. Many of the fresh troops used in the offensive were very young recruits or older soldiers called back into service. Replacements were increasingly scarce. The Allies, though shaken by the initial attacks, regrouped quickly. French and British commanders coordinated their responses more effectively than in previous years. General Ferdinand Foch was appointed as the Allied Supreme Commander. unifying command structures and improving strategic coordination. The arrival of American troops, though not yet decisive in numbers, provided a psychological boost and the promise of fresh strength. By the summer of that year, the German advance had stalled. The Allies began to counterattack. At the Second Battle of the MN in July, Franco-American forces pushed back a major German offensive. In August, the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive, a series of sustained attacks that steadily drove the Germans out of their hard-won positions. The German army, battered and demoralized, began a general retreat. On the home front, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The hopes raised by the spring offensive had vanished. Instead of victory, Germans faced continued shortages, deepening hunger, and a sense of betrayal. The naval blockade remained in full effect. Cities struggled with food distribution. The black market flourished, while the official ration system collapsed under the weight of demand and mismanagement. Industrial strikes spread again, and political agitation intensified. The working class, bearing the brunt of war fatigue, turned increasingly toward radical politics. The Independent Social Democratic Party, pacifist unions, and revolutionary groups gained influence. The government tried to maintain order, but it was losing control over public sentiment. Among the military, morale eroded further. Desertions increased. Discipline became harder to enforce. Letters from the front revealed growing disillusionment. The once proud officer corps began to question whether the war could still be won or whether it should even continue. The leadership of the German Empire, meanwhile, entered a state of denial and paralysis. Kaiser Wilhelm II, never known for decisive leadership, became increasingly isolated and out of touch. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, though still commanding the army, now faced political pressure to find an exit from the war. By September, Ludendorff shocked his colleagues by admitting that the war was lost. In a closed meeting with civilian leaders, he argued that Germany must seek an armistice immediately. He suggested that the blame for defeat be shifted to civilian authorities and democratic politicians, a political maneuver that would have lasting consequences in post-war Germany. In October, the government, under Chancellor Georg von Hertling, resigned. A new chancellor, Prince Max of Baden, was appointed and tasked with negotiating peace. For the first time, Germany moved toward constitutional reform. The military command was nominally subordinated to the civilian government, and talks with the Allies were initiated based on the peace proposals outlined by American President Woodrow Wilson. But events moved faster than the government could respond. In the Navy, plans for a final suicidal assault against the British fleet sparked open revolt among sailors at Kiel. The mutiny spread rapidly to other ports and then to cities across Germany. Workers' and soldiers' councils, reminiscent of the Russian Soviets, began to form calling for peace, democracy, and the end of the monarchy. By early November, revolution was underway. Bavarian politicians declared the end of the monarchy in Munich. Other regional leaders followed. Crowds gathered in Berlin demanding the abdication of the Kaiser. Army units refused to fire on demonstrators. The empire was unraveling, not under foreign occupation, but from within. On the 9th of November, faced with overwhelming pressure, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The same day, the German Republic was proclaimed from a balcony of the Reichstag building by Social Democratic leader Philipp Schiedemann. The centuries-old German monarchy had come to an end. 2 days later, on the 11th of November, the armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. The guns fell silent at the 11th hour. The war was over. The collapse of the Kaiserreich was not the result of a single defeat, but of accumulated failures, military, political, economic, and moral. The spring offensive had been the final gamble, the last chance to turn the tide. When it failed, the edifice of the empire crumbled rapidly. As the autumn of the year 1918 unfolded, the German Empire stood on the edge of collapse. The failure of the spring offensive, the relentless Allied counterattacks, and the deepening crisis on the home front had left the imperial government in a state of political paralysis. The once confident leadership of the Kaiserreich could no longer contain the growing wave of unrest sweeping across the nation. What began as military defeat was rapidly transforming into a social and political revolution. In the final days of October, unrest reached the German Navy. At the naval base of Wilhelmshaven, sailors learned that the High Seas Fleet was being ordered out to sea in what many believed would be a suicidal final engagement against the British Royal Navy. The war was effectively lost, and the idea of sacrificing lives in a symbolic gesture of defiance sparked outrage. Sailors refused to weigh anchor. Mutiny spread quickly from ship to ship. By the beginning of November, the revolt had expanded beyond the navy. In Kiel, sailors and workers took control of the city. Soldiers and workers' councils were formed, modeled on the revolutionary Soviets of Russia. Their demands included not only peace, but also sweeping political change, democratic reforms, the removal of the monarchy, and social justice. The uprising spread like wildfire across Germany. Within days, major cities, Hamburg, Bremen, Munich, Cologne, were in open revolt. Military discipline crumbled. Local authorities either fled or tried to negotiate with the revolutionaries. The imperial government, recognizing that control was slipping away, tried to act quickly. On the 3rd of October, Prince Max of Baden had been appointed Chancellor, replacing the conservative Georg von Hertling. Prince Max represented a moderate voice acceptable to both traditional elites and reformist factions. His mission was to oversee the transition toward peace and political reform. In an unprecedented move, constitutional changes were enacted. The Chancellor would now be responsible to the Reichstag. Rather than the Kaiser and the military command would be subordinated to civilian authority. These measures were intended to appease domestic unrest and convince the Allies that Germany was moving toward democracy. But these reforms came too late. The revolutionaries were not merely demanding constitutional adjustments. They wanted a clean break with the old order. Workers and soldiers, exhausted from years of war and sacrifice, saw no future in a system dominated by aristocrats, industrialists, and military officers. They demanded the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II and the establishment of a republic. Kaiser Wilhelm, meanwhile, was in Spa, Belgium, where the German military headquarters were located. Despite growing pressure, he refused to abdicate. He still believed he had the loyalty of the army. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had advised him to step down earlier, but Wilhelm clung to the hope that he could retain at least the Prussian crown, if not the imperial title. Events on the ground rendered these hopes irrelevant. In Berlin, mass demonstrations escalated. Revolutionary crowds joined by striking workers and returning soldiers marched through the streets. On the 9th of November, faced with the threat of violence and complete chaos, Prince Max of Baden took unilateral action. Without the Kaiser's formal consent, he announced Wilhelm's abdication and declared that the emperor had renounced both the imperial and Prussian thrones. This decision was not merely administrative. It was symbolic. It signaled the end of the Hohenzollern dynasty's rule over Germany, a lineage that traced back centuries. The German Empire, established in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in the year 1871, had been brought down by defeat abroad and revolution at home. On the same day, Prince Max handed over the chancellorship to Friedrich Art, the leader of the majority Social Democrats. Abbott was a pragmatic politician, committed to parliamentary democracy and determined to stabilize the country. But events were moving too fast for careful planning. That afternoon, Philip Schiedemann, a fellow Social Democrat, took the initiative. Fearing that radical revolutionaries might declare a Soviet-style republic, Schiedemann stepped onto a balcony of the Reichstag building and proclaimed the German Republic. His words spoken to a crowd below marked the public and official end of the monarchy. He had not consulted Art or even party leadership, but the act was irreversible. Only a few hours later, in a different part of Berlin, the revolutionary socialist Karl Liebknecht, recently released from prison, declared the formation of a free socialist republic. Although his proclamation was less widely accepted and lacked legal authority, it showed the deep divisions among the revolutionary forces and foreshadowed the political conflicts to come. Wilhelm II, now without a throne or a clear path forward, fled to the Netherlands, where he would live in exile until his death many years later. The Kaiser, who had once promised to lead Germany to greatness, now departed quietly, his imperial ambitions reduced to memory. The newly formed republic faced an immediate and daunting challenge. The war was still technically ongoing. Armistice negotiations were underway, but no agreement had yet been signed. Germany's military remained deployed across vast swaths of France and Belgium. The Allies demanded not only a halt to hostilities, but also a complete withdrawal and disarmament. Friedrich Eerd, leading the provisional government, sought to avoid chaos. He feared that further revolution, particularly from radical leftist groups like the Protestists, would plunge the country into civil war. To maintain order, Art made a controversial pact with the German military known as the Abbott-Groener Pact. It secured the army's support for the new government in exchange for promises to preserve military structure and suppress further revolutionary activity. This agreement set the stage for the post-war politics of the Weimar Republic. On the one hand, it allowed for a relatively peaceful transition and ensured that the Republic survived its fragile beginnings. On the other, it tied the fate of the democratic government to the very institutions that had upheld the imperial regime, a contradiction that would haunt the Republic in the years to come. The armistice was signed 2 days later on the 11th of November in a railway carriage in the forest of Campania. Germany agreed to withdraw its forces from occupied territories, surrender large quantities of military equipment, and accept severe restrictions. Although the terms were harsh, they were not yet the final peace that would come months later with the Treaty of Versailles. In the immediate aftermath, the mood in Germany was complex and contradictory. Relief at the end of the war was mixed with confusion, anger, and a profound sense of loss. Some welcomed the fall of the monarchy and the birth of a republic. Others mourned what they saw as a betrayal, a collapse engineered by revolutionaries, socialists, and civilians rather than by battlefield defeat. This narrative that Germany had been stabbed in the back by internal enemies was not yet fully formed, but it had begun to circulate among conservatives, former officers, and nationalist groups. It would soon become a powerful myth, shaping post-war politics and undermining the legitimacy of the Weimar government. For now, however, Germany stood at a historic crossroads. The old imperial order was gone. A new republic, uncertain and fragile, had been born not through reform, but through revolution. Its leaders inherited a nation exhausted by war, scarred by loss, and divided in vision. The challenge ahead was immense. To rebuild a shattered society, restore economic stability, and forge a democratic future from the ruins of empire. The German Empire existed for just under half a century, from its proclamation in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in the year 1871 to its collapse amid revolution and armistice in November of 1918. In those years, it reshaped the European continent, altered the balance of global power, and left a legacy that would echo far beyond its formal end. At its foundation, the empire had been a bold experiment. The unification of desperate German states under Prussian leadership through military success, diplomatic maneuvering, and political calculation. It was not born from popular consent or liberal reform, but from war. The empire carried within it the contradictions of its own creation. Federal in structure, but dominated by one state. Industrially modern, but politically conservative. Socially dynamic, yet governed by a rigid elite. The chancellorship of Otto von Bismarck defined the early years of the empire. His domestic policies, combining repression and reform, sought to secure unity and stability in a rapidly changing society. His foreign policy, careful and restrained, kept Germany at the center of European affairs without provoking direct confrontation. Yet the system he built was highly dependent on his personal control. Once removed, it proved brittle. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, the empire took a more assertive and unpredictable path. Weltpolitik, naval expansion, and colonial ambitions reflected Germany's growing economic and military power, but also fueled anxiety among other great powers. Diplomatic isolation, a naval arms race with Britain, and rising tensions with France and Russia all contributed to the breakdown of European stability. Domestically, the empire struggled to adapt to the forces it had unleashed. Industrialization created new social classes, political movements, and demands for participation. The rise of the Social Democratic Party, the growth of trade unions, and the spread of popular culture revealed a society in motion. Yet, the imperial political system resisted meaningful reform. Power remained concentrated in the hands of the Kaiser, the military, and conservative elites. When the First World War began, the empire entered the conflict with confidence and a belief in its own strength. But the war exposed the weaknesses of its foundations. A military strategy built on speed failed to deliver. The economic system buckled under the strain of blockade and total mobilization. The social fabric frayed under the pressures of hunger, loss, and disillusionment. In its final year, the empire collapsed from within. The revolution of 1918 was not just the result of battlefield defeat, but of cumulative failures, political, strategic, and moral. The abdication of the Kaiser and the proclamation of the Republic marked the end of one era and the uncertain beginning of another. Yet, the story of the German Empire did not end. In 1918, its legacy continued to shape the 20th century in profound ways. The unresolved tensions of its final years between militarism and democracy, nationalism and pluralism, elite control and popular participation would reappear in new forms in the troubled years of the Weimar Republic and beyond. The myth that the empire had been betrayed from within, the so-called stab-in-the-back legend, undermined confidence in the democratic order that followed. It fueled resentment, encouraged conspiracy theories, and provided fertile ground for extremist movements. In this sense, the failure to fully reckon with the empire's collapse became one of its most enduring consequences. Yet, not all aspects of the imperial legacy were negative. Germany's scientific, technological, and cultural contributions during this period remain remarkable. The foundations of the modern welfare state pioneered under Bismarck continue to influence social policy today. The tensions between federalism and central authority, between tradition and change, remain relevant to many modern states. Perhaps the most lasting lesson of the German Empire is that power without accountability and ambition without restraint carries inherent risk. The empire's pursuit of status, influence, and security led it to overreach diplomatically, militarily, and politically. Its inability to adapt to social change, its reliance on hierarchical authority, and its failure to broaden political participation ultimately undermined its capacity to endure. In remembering the German Empire, it is essential to move beyond nostalgia or condemnation. It was neither a golden age nor a historical aberration, but a complex chapter in the unfolding story of modern Europe. Its rise and fall illuminate the possibilities and perils of nation-building in the industrial age. Its history challenges us to consider how societies manage change, distribute power, and respond to crisis. More than a century has passed since the empire's end, but the questions it raised about identity, governance, and the uses of power remain with us. To study the German Empire is not merely to look backward, but to reflect more clearly on the paths we choose today. Although the German Empire's magnificent palaces and massive warships have been consigned to the dusty pages of history, the industrial and disciplined legacy they left behind continues to influence the world today. Completing this daunting and suffocating panorama, we witnessed how power was built. Take care of yourselves until our next journey of discovery.